All rise, veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is now in session. L'audience du Tribunal Pénal International pour l'ex-Yougoslavie est ouverte. Please be seated.
Good morning, Madam Registrar. Could you call the case, please?
Good morning, Your Honors. This is the case number IT0588T, the prosecutor versus Popović.
I thank you, Madam. Good morning to you once more. Mr. Popović, can you follow the proceedings in a language that you can understand?
Well,
Yes, I can.
I thank you and good morning to you. Mr. Beara, can you follow the proceedings in your own language?
Yes, I can.
Mr. Nikolić, can you follow the proceedings in your own language?
Mogu.
Yes, I can.
Mr. Borovčanin, same question.
Yes.
I thank you. Mr. Miletić, same question.
I'm not receiving interpretation.
Mogu, samo nema prevoda.
Yes, I can, but I'm not receiving interpretation.
Yes, I will repeat the same question to you. Are you receiving interpretation now?
Sada da.
Yes, I am.
I thank you. And can you follow the proceedings in your own language, in other words?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Mr. Gvero, same question to you.
Mogu.
I can.
Okay, I thank you. And Mr. Pandurević.
Dobro jutro, časni sude.
Good
Da,
morning,
mogu, hvala.
Your Honor. Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, I thank you all and good morning to you all. Appearances for the prosecution.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. My name is Peter McCloskey. Together with me today is Madam Prosecutor Carla Del Ponte and the attorneys from the Srebrenica JEPA trial team, Julian Nichols, Nelson Thayer, and Lada Shulyan.
Okay, I thank you, Mr. McCloskey, and good morning to you as well, Madame Del Ponte, and the rest of the team. Appearances for Vujadin Popović.
Good morning, Your Honors. For Vujadin Popović, Zoran Živanović, lead counsel, Julie Kanda, co-counsel, and Kelly Pitcher, case manager.
I thank you, Mr. Živanović, and good morning to you and your team. Appearances for Ljubiša Beara.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. My name is John Stojic. I'm here with my team members, Mr. Chris Meek and Mr. Nebojša Mrkić, on behalf of Ljubiša Beara.
I thank you, Mr. Ostojic, and good morning to you and your team. Appearances for Drago Nikolić.
Good morning, Your Honors. My name is Jelena Nikolić, and together with Mr. Stefan Burgon and Bojan Stefanovic, our case manager, we represent Mr. Drago Nikolić.
I thank you, Madam Nikolić, and good morning to you and your team. Appearances for accused Ljubomir Borovčanin.
Good morning, Your Honors. My name is Aleksandar Lazarević. By my side is Mr. Miodrag Stojanić and Ms. Tatjana Čmerić. We will represent Mr. Borovčanin.
I thank you, Mr. Lazarević, and good morning to you and your team. Appearances for Radivoj Miletić.
Good morning, Your Honors. I'm Natasha Fuvo-Ivanovic, and I represent Radivoj Miletić together with my assistant, Mr. Nikolić.
I thank you, Madam Ivanovic, and good morning to you and your team. Milan Gvero.
Good morning, Your Honors. Drago Nikolić and Natalie Wagner for General Gvero.
I thank you, Mr. Kirgovic, and good morning to you and your team. And finally, appearances for Vinko Pandurević.
Your Honour, I, Peter Haynes, appear together with Mr. Georges Sarapa for Vinko Pandurević. We're assisted in court today by our case manager, Helena Kaka.
I thank you and good morning to you and your team, Mr. Haynes. So, before we move ahead with the opening statement of the prosecution, are there any preliminaries? Yes, Madame Favot.
Monsieur le Président,
Your Honour, I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that the accused have not received the operative indictment which was filed on the 4th of August 2006 in BCS.
What about the other accused? In other words, is yours an exception, or does it apply to each and every one of the accused? Yeah, I see Mr. Kirgovic, Mr. Zivanovic, Mr. Ostojic, and Mr. Nikolić and Mr. Lazarevic. So, Madam Registrar, what's the problem? Why haven't they received a copy of the operative indictment in their own language?
Yes, it's been translation process. I will find out and I will back to you.
All right.
Certainly.
We'll work on it, Madame Favot and the other counsel. And we'll see to it that it is distributed without any undue delay. Any further preliminary matters? Yes, Mr. Bougon.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, judges. Mr. President, I would like at this time, and before we proceed with the opening statement of the prosecution, to present a oral joint motion for reconsideration of the decision issued by the trial chamber on Friday, the 18th of August, 2006. We are of the view, Mr. President, on behalf of all 7 accused in this trial, that this motion must be heard before we proceed with the prosecution's opening statement for a number of reasons, including the fact that the motion, of course, deals with all 7 accused in this case. Secondly, the motion concerns the proceedings as a whole, as well as the fairness of the proceedings.
One moment, Mr. Bougon. If you're going to make submissions, we'll give you a time limit within which to make your submissions. We'll give equal time to the prosecution to reply, and we will hand down our oral decision soon after, as soon as practical. And then we can start. But if you're going to make submissions, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will get straight to the point.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes, certainly.
This matter has been decided on in a written decision, and we object, especially at this time, at this critical time, to any delay. If this matter, if you think it should be discussed in court, I would request that any discussion be made at the end of the trial day, and that we allow the prosecutor to make her statement, and that I begin my statement, and then we handle this later. But this matter has been dealt with.
Yes, but there is an intimation that the joint defense teams would like to have the matter reconsidered. So let's hear what they have to say. You will be given every opportunity to reply, and then we'll hand down our decision soon after, or as soon as practical. But I can assure you the matter will be dealt with in a final manner this morning, within the next 20 minutes or so. Yes, Mr. Bougon.
Thank you, Mr. President. As mentioned, with 5 minutes.
Please restrict yourself to any submissions which are new and not those that we have already decided upon.
Will do, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Mr. President, the legal basis for this motion is the Appeals Chamber decision of June 2006 in the Zigic case, saying that a trial chamber may and has the power to reconsider its decision on the basis of either a change of circumstances or on the basis that the decision is erroneous and has caused a prejudice to the defense. All defense attorneys in this case, Mr. President, believe that both of the aspects of this test are met in this case. Moving straight away to the situation of the change of circumstances. In the decision, the trial chamber recognized that the prosecution had not fulfilled entirely its disclosure obligation. However, it did recognize that, or maybe it was not satisfied, that the partial non-disclosure by the prosecution has denied the defense the ability to prepare adequately for trial. The order said the prosecution is to comply without delay with its disclosure obligation pursuant to Rule 65 ter Echo 3I, and the prosecution is to provide the defense before or by the commencement of trial proceedings with an update of its witnesses for August and September, which shall include a list of exhibits to be used with each. Under the heading Change in Circumstances, I respectfully submit on behalf of all the accused the following. Firstly, the prosecution has not provided the defense, as it was ordered to do, a revised list of witnesses for August and September, along with a list of exhibits to be used. Secondly, the prosecution has not provided the defense since the decision with any further disclosure of exhibits that it intends to offer at trial. Thirdly, the prosecution has failed, as ordered by the trial chamber on 30 June, to file its proofing chart for all witnesses in this case by 18 August 2006, last Friday, as it was ordered to do. Fourthly, on 18 August, the prosecution filed a new motion for 3 additional witnesses, as well as 360 new documents to be added in this case. For sure, Mr. President, the prosecution knew when it responded to the defense motion that it was about to file 360 new documents and ask for 3 more witnesses. For sure, Mr. President, the prosecution knew that it would not be able to file its proofing chart by Friday when it responded to the defense motion. Fifthly, Mr. President, the defense still has not received a full index indicating the material that is necessary or that is relevant for each of the witnesses in this case. Meaning that for each witness, we have consistently been asking the prosecution to provide us with what is the material: statements, interviews, prior testimonies, information reports, and any documents which may have been provided by each of the witnesses. This information, Mr. President, is required at this time, and it has not yet been provided. It is not for the defense to look for this information. It is for the prosecution to provide this information. Sixthly, Mr. President, the defense has not yet received the information requested in order to make the prosecution pretrial brief a meaningful document. This was brought to the attention of the prosecution in both some of the pretrial briefs filed by the defense, as well as on 14 July during the pro forma beginning of this trial. We believe, Mr. President, that all of this is a change of circumstances that warrant a reconsideration of the motion. Under the heading Prejudice to the Defense, I will make it short and simply address 2 categories which need further emphasis, namely the issue of the intercept material. 150 at least intercept material which have not yet been provided to the defense in English. This material, Mr. President, for sure must have been reviewed and analyzed by the prosecution at some point, and in addition, it must have been reviewed by the lead trial attorney from the prosecution. The prosecution cannot deny that this material is important for its case, yet the defense does not have it in English in order to prepare for this trial. Secondly, Mr. President, the issue of the operational logs. Both of these issues were addressed in our motion, and we are under the, we respectfully submit that they have not been addressed sufficiently or considered in rendering the decision. These operational logs is a tool that will be absolutely required by both the defense and the trial chamber alike, with a view to being able to understand better these witnesses. Looking at the prejudice, Mr. President, when we look at the missing material, when we look at the missing translations, when we look at the fact that we do not have the proofing chart ordered for 18 August, that we do not have a proper pretrial brief, that we do not have an updated witness list, that we do not have a list of material for each witness. This, Mr. President, has hampered defense preparations to a point where it is necessary to postpone the proceedings in this case. Now, we opened up in terms of our last submission, which was our reply. We said we will proceed this week with those two first witnesses. We will proceed with those with the opening statements if that is the wish of the trial chamber. However, before any further meaningful or witnesses which address a lot of exhibit testify before this chamber, they should, Mr. President, at least 10 days before we get all the material and the testimony of the first such witness. This is my 5 minutes. I would have much more to say, but in a gist, this is what on behalf of all 7 accused in this case, we believe that there is a prejudice to the defense and that there is a need to postpone the proceedings in this case, maybe not for long, but what is important is the prosecution must be in a position or must have a way to fulfill its obligation so that we can have this trial started on a firm and sound basis.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. President, on behalf of all accused in this case.
I thank Mr. Bourgon also for staying within the time limit. Mr. McCloskey, you have 5 minutes.
Mr. President, first of all, having this thrown at me like this, I've tried to keep track of what he's saying, but it's difficult because when he says that he hasn't received the proofing chart. The proofing chart has been filed. And so I don't know what the problem is, and I don't know what else is a problem that really is not in what he said, because the proofing chart is filed. The updated exhibit and witness list, we have a stack right here ready to give to them. I had thought it had been given electronically, so I'd asked my co-counsel not to pass it out right at the end of the hour. Apparently it's not been sent electronically, but we have it, so it's here. The other matter, the over 300 new documents. Well,
that's the subject matter of an outstanding motion. I mean, if you deal with it very briefly, in the same way it has been submitted, or along the same lines it has been made reference to by Mr. Bourgon. Okay, otherwise please go on to the next point. I mean, the idea is that this should, the fact that there is this outstanding motion in itself should delay the commencement of the case. Do you agree to that?
Yes, I think that makes sense. If I could just mention, so Your Honor's aware that why there's 300 some odd new exhibits, very briefly. The Miletić trial brief surprised us in where he denied any involvement in providing humanitarian aid. We had over 200 documents with his name on it. They're pro forma convoy type documents, not all of which have been translated. So out of an abundance of caution in response to the pre-trial brief, we've got those to the defense as soon as we could. They're not all translated. So many of these documents are in response to pre-trial brief issues that we now are understand will be contested at trial. We've tried to avoid dumping enormous numbers of documents on the defense early on in the exhibit list. And so we will hope to be adding as issues come up, not in a huge bulk. Frankly, the other issues he mentioned, the intercepts, the logs, I could discuss those at length, but we've discussed those in our brief. There's no need to, especially for the logs, to translate all the information in all the logs. We've translated them to the part that is most relevant. The intercepts, we're doing our best to translate as quick as we can, and we've left some 100, 150 as potentially relevant intercepts And I hope to perhaps cut off some of those intercepts as I get the translations. But our analysts said they appeared relevant, so out of an abundance of caution, we've put those on our list. And that's the group we're talking about. I don't have any English translations that we're holding back.
How soon will you be making use, or do you anticipate you'll be making use of any of these intercept or operational logs with witnesses?
Months and months.
All right, okay, go ahead.
The end of the guts of this case, the documents and the intercepts, it comes at the end of the case. And I think we've all tried to examine how long this will take, but probably not between 6 and 9 months down the road.
All right, okay. Yes, anything else?
I think that's the most of it, Your Honor.
Okay, I thank you. So we'll have a very short break, 3 minutes, 4 minutes maximum, and we'll come back with the decision. Yes, I see both Mr. Bougon and Madame Favreau. Mr. Bougon.
Mr. President, if I can have, please, with your permission, 1 minute to apply.
Yes, go
There
ahead.
has been no proofing chart file. There is a proofing chart file back in July, but there was one segment for 18th of August which has not been filed, unless it was filed after hours on Friday, but we even checked with court management this morning. It has not been filed. The Miletić document deals with the main staff. This is joint criminal enterprise case. All accused in this case must review these documents. All we hear from the prosecution is inadvertently, abundance of caution, 11th hour, avoiding dumping. It's a matter, Mr. President, of what message the trial chamber wants to send to the justice community, to the judicial community, in terms of, can we start this trial on a firm basis, or do we just say time is the only thing that matters? Prosecution, you can do what you want, doesn't matter as long as we get this trial going. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you, Mr. Bougon. Madame Favreau.
Monsieur le Président, je serai très
Your Honor, I would be very grateful to the prosecution if it could quote the brief I have filed, because the terms used by the prosecutor are not quite the terms which we used in our pretrial brief.
I thank you. Do you have any further comments, Mr. McCloskey, before we retire for our deliberations?
No, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mr. Kirgović.
Your Honor, there is a set of documents that have just been submitted that apply to my client among the 360. I'm not talking about documents that apply only to General Miletić. There are other documents that apply to other accused as well.
From my experience here over the last 5 years, that is something that continues, goes on and on and on throughout the entire trial. Documents keep arriving as they come to the surface. And we usually intervene when we are convinced that you need time to go through them before you can proceed with the case. But let's see whether that's the case now. We'll retire for a few minutes. We'll come back with our oral decision. Thank you.
All rise, veuillez vous lever. All rise, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated.
So. So the trial chamber is seized of a joint defense motion made this morning for reconsideration of its decision filed last Friday on another joint defense motion for postponement of the commencement of the trial. This is our oral decision. We have heard oral submissions by parties. We have confirmed that the proofing chart that was expected to be filed by last Friday was indeed filed, although it seems it has not been distributed. We consider the submission relating to the prosecution request to add 3 witnesses and about 360 fresh exhibits to be the subject matter of an outstanding motion and should be dealt with as such in that motion and not as a reason for delaying the commencement of or for postponing the commencement of the trial. Equally, we have heard confirmation from the prosecution that the intercept material and operational logs will be made use of with witnesses at a much later stage in the proceedings. We do not consider any of the other so-called fresh circumstances mentioned this morning by Mr. Bourgon and others, such as to warrant a postponement in the commencement of the trial. Consequently, we stand by our decision of last Friday, which denied the joint defense motion for postponement of the commencement of proceedings, and we order that the proceedings in this trial be proceeded with forthwith. Thank you. Any further preliminary matters? I hear none. So, Madame Del Ponte, I take it you wanted the floor first before Mr. McCloskey. Go ahead.
Yes, Your Honors, Mr. President. Yes, indeed, I would like to make a few brief opening remarks before Senior Trial Attorney Peter McCloskey addresses you. For those of us gathered here today, over a decade and nearly 2,000 kilometers removed from the events of Srebrenica in July 1995, it is difficult, if not impossible, to comprehend the scale of the horror inflicted on the inhabitants of the Srebrenica enclave. Words cannot convey the magnitude of the crimes committed and the suffering endured by the victims. For the survivors, the wounds have not yet healed and the suffering continues. For many of them, it still feels like only yesterday that they were forcibly separated from their families and saw their loved ones taken away by armed soldiers, never to see them again. In most cases, never to learn what finally happened to them. Before the war, Srebrenica was known mainly for the local mining industry and for its health spas. The town was not particularly well known outside of the former Yugoslavia. In 1991, the population was approximately 75% Muslim. Now, the name of Srebrenica is infamous. Srebrenica is invariably associated with the most heinous of crimes: forcible transfer, mass murder, and genocide. It is beyond reasonable dispute that genocide and other crimes against humanity were committed in Srebrenica in July 1995. These terrible facts have been proven in other trials held before this tribunal. The facts of the forcible transfer of the population and the mass executions have also been painstakingly established by investigations and reports of the United Nations Human Rights Organization and governments. As just one example, let me read you a portion of the concluding paragraph of the 15 November 1999 report of the Secretary General pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 5335. The fall of Srebrenica, and I quote, "The body of this report sets out in meticulous, systematic, exhaustive, and ultimately harrowing detail the descent of Srebrenica into a horror without parallel in the history of Europe since the Second World War. I urge all concerned to study this report carefully and to let the facts speak for themselves. The men who have been charged with these crimes against humanity reminded the world, and in particular the United Nations, that evil exists in the world." Unquote. Your Honors, the facts do indeed speak for themselves. Let me quickly discuss some of the key facts which are before and will be proven beyond reasonable doubt in this trial. In July 1995, the Bosnian Serb Army, or VRS, implemented the final phase of a comprehensive criminal plan to permanently erase the Muslim population of Srebrenica. As is well known, the enclave fell to the VRS on 11 July 1995 after a brief military campaign. Within 3 days, in an atmosphere of utter terror, tens of thousands of citizens, women, children, and the elderly were forcibly removed from the enclave by the VRS and Bosnian Serb police forces. What little the victims could carry they brought with them in bundles as they were loaded into overcrowded buses in the village of Potocari near Srebrenica. The separation of Potocari was captured by a Serb cameraman, and you will see scenes of these poor, terrified people being forced forth from their homes. You will hear first-hand evidence of the fact that the men and boys gathered in Potocari were prevented by armed soldiers from entering the buses with their families. Instead, they were separated from their wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters. These men and boys, aged approximately 15 to 78, faced a far grimmer fate. After being separated from their families, they were confined in cramped detention facilities under brutal conditions. Their meager belongings were taken away from them, piled up, and burned. In the following weeks, VRS and police forces systematically murdered over 7,000 Muslim men and boys from the Srebrenica enclave. The victims included those separated from their families in Potocari, as well as thousands of men and boys who either surrendered or were captured as they tried to flee the enclave. These victims, civilians, as well as soldiers who had set down their arms, were detained, murdered in firing squads, and bulldozed into mass graves. Where are the victims of these mass executions today? Most of them remain together in mass primary or secondary graves, hidden in the woods and buried beneath the fields. They lie together, many of them undoubtedly still bound by wire and blindfolds. For the evidence shows that many victims were bound with ligatures and blindfolded in order to make their murder easier for the executions. These were not deaths sustained, as it has been argued, in combat. And that is what this case is about, Your Honors. An entire population erased. Women, children, and the elderly forced from their homes. Defenseless men and boys executed by firing squad, buried in mass graves and then dug up and buried once again in an effort to conceal the truth from the world. But the lasting tragedy of Srebrenica, the living legacy of this atrocity, is with the families left behind. The women and children forced to live their lives deprived of their fathers, without their husbands, their brothers, their sons, their neighbors, the community gone. The continuing impact of these crimes on the Muslim population of Srebrenica was evident most recently at the ceremony last month in Potocari commemorating the 11th anniversary of the fall of Srebrenica. Thousands of mourners, mainly women, gathered there for the burial of still more victims at the memorial center. At the ceremony, over 500 more victims of genocide were buried. They joined some 2,000 other victims in the ground of the cemetery at the memorial center. However, all too many victims still await a proper burial. To date, over 3,000 victims have been exhumed by the Office of the Prosecutor and the international community. They are stored anonymously in morgues, bearing tags, waiting for identification that in many cases may never be realized. For some of the survivors, a minority, there is at least the sense of certainty that comes when a missing loved one is finally found and identified. However, for far too many of the survivors, there is not even this small measure of relief. The questions remain: what happened to my father, my husband, my son? Why was he killed? Where is he? What were his last moments like? Why did this happen to us? Let me read you something said by one survivor, witness DD, in previous Srebrenica trial about the loss of a child and how she still felt the pain years after he was taken from her in Potocari, and he remains among the missing. I quote, "As a mother, I still have hope. I just can't believe that this is true. How is it possible that a human being could do something like this, could destroy everything, could kill so many people? Just imagine this youngest boy I had, those little hands of his, how could they be dead? I imagine those hands picking strawberries, reading books, going to school, going on excursions. Every morning I wake up, I cover my eyes not to look at other children going to school and husbands going to work, holding hands." Unquote. The pain expressed in those words is felt by every survivor who still waits to learn the fate of a loved one. Justice. Your Honors, the ceremony of Potocari was, of course, a ceremony of loss and grief, but it was also a ceremony of hope. Hope for justice. And with justice, the hope for reconciliation between peoples. With justice comes the hope for a lasting peace. The surviving victims of these crimes yearn for justice, not revenge. There is a passage which the Grand Mufti of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Mustafa Efendija Čerić, often states in his prayers and appeals to people to remember the crimes of Srebrenica and pray that they shall never be perpetrated again against any people. I would like to repeat it to you. Revenge is not a Bosnian tradition. Revenge is not a Bosnian measure. The truth is our belief, and justice is our destiny. This trial is the next phase in bringing to justice those men most responsible for all of the crimes against humanity committed in Srebrenica and Jepa. there have been other trials concerned with the crimes in Srebrenica. These trials have exposed the truth and punished some of the guilty, but all of those individuals most responsible for this genocide, and indeed the other crimes committed in Srebrenica, have not yet been brought to justice. This trial is an important step towards that goal. These 7 accused, Your Honors, officers serving below Ratko Mladic and Ratko Tolimir are among those most responsible for the terrible crimes committed in Srebrenica as set forth in the indictment. The crimes that are the subject of this indictment in this case were committed with brutality, boldness, and impunity in equal measure. The separation of the women and children from the men and boys in Potočar and their forcible expulsion while the men and boys were detained awaiting execution took place in front of rolling television cameras. It was broadcast around the world as the crimes occurred, and of course you will see much of this video evidence during the course of the trial. It is right to recall, as we start this trial, that the ICTY was created in the face of continued and serious violation of international humanitarian law in the former Yugoslavia. This judicial institution is the product of one of the most important measures taken by the Security Council, acting for all member states of the United Nations to restore and maintain international peace and security. That is our collective mission, our responsibility and our contribution to peace and security, to bring to justice those individuals responsible for the most serious crimes known to humanity. The crimes that are the subject of this trial, genocide, the crimes against humanity, and violations of the laws or customs of war as set forth in the indictment, and indeed all the crimes within the jurisdiction of the tribunals are crimes of such a magnitude that they endure us all. These crimes are offenses against the victims and all of humankind, because they are of a scale that offend our deepest principle of human rights and human dignity. The trials before this tribunal have proven that international law is not merely theory nor an abstract concept. International law is and must be a fully functioning system to protect our values and regulate behavior in civilized society. To achieve this goal, crime which shocks the consciousness of humanity, crimes against us all, cannot be permitted to go unpunished. I bring these accused before your honors to face the charges against them. I do so on behalf of the international community and in the name of all the member states of the United Nations. And as with all accused in this tribunal, they are brought before you to be tried for their individual criminal responsibility. No state, no nationality, no organization is on trial for these crimes. Crimes are committed by individual people, and individual people must be held responsible for their criminal acts. There is no such thing as collective guilt before this tribunal. The case against these accused will be difficult and will take time. The very number of accused in this case will invariably result in challenges for the prosecution, your honors, and the defense. However, I know that each of the accused will receive a fair trial in accordance with the highest standard of international justice. There can be no justice without the utmost respect for the rights of the accused, And I'm certain that this trial will reflect the absolute commitment of the Office of the Prosecutor to upholding the rights of the accused, as well as those of the victims and witnesses. As I said earlier, the surviving victims of the Srebrenica crimes yearned for justice, not vengeance. They look towards this tribunal to provide justice, to prove the truth of what happened to them, and to convict the guilty. This trial is an important step towards and a cause for hope. However, at the commencement of this trial, we must also acknowledge with regret that the effort to bring to justice the most responsible for the terrible crimes in the former Yugoslavia, including the darkest chapter, the genocide in Srebrenica, is incomplete. And fortunately, two men who should be sitting as accused before your honors right now in this courtroom are still at large. I refer, of course, to Ratko Mladić and Zdravko Tolimir. It is absolutely scandalous that these men, along with Radovan Karadzic, have not been arrested and delivered to the tribunal to face the charges brought against them. The government of the Republic of Serbia is fully capable of arresting these men. It has simply, until now, refused to do so. Tolimir was, as you know, indicted and joined to the accused in the case before you today. Now, because of the refusal of Serbia to arrest him, his case must be severed from the indictment. Mladić should be on trial in this case. It was always hoped and indeed expected that he would be delivered to the tribunal in time to have his case joined to this trial. Again, the inexcusable refusal to arrest and transfer Mladić means that another Srebrenica trial must be held in the future, when Mladić and Tolimir will be in custody. And make no mistake, he, Mladić, Tolimir, Karadzic, and all the remaining fugitives will be arrested. They will be brought to The Hague and they will be tried to the crimes. This is our pledge to the international community, to the women who mourned for their loss in Potocari, and to all victims of the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. Your Honors, Mr. President, I have said what I came before you to say. I have absolute confidence that you will conduct this trial with fairness to all parties and reach a just verdict. With your authorization, I give the floor now to Senior Trial Attorney Peter McCloskey. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you, Madam Del Ponte, Mr. McCloskey. We'll have a break at 10:30. Thank you.
Mr. President, Your Honors, it's a great honor and a privilege to be here before you today to give you my opening statement. In 1992, Karadzic and Mladić had a plan for an ethnically pure Bosnian state. For over 3 years, their plan was brutally executed on a massive scale by intimidation, terror. Excuse me, if I could ask the discussion. This campaign began with the war in the spring of 1992 and continued throughout the conflict, culminating in the removal of the Muslim population from eastern Bosnia in July 1995 and the Srebrenica genocide. Karadzic and Mladic relied upon a few close associates and a political and military system perverted to carry out their war against the Muslim and Croatian armies and the Muslim and Croatian people of Bosnia. I'm not suggesting that the conduct of the entire war was criminal, but in eastern Bosnia and elsewhere, each of the major military endeavors had two objectives. First, beat the enemy. Fair enough, that's war. Second, move out the Muslim population. That is the crime that brought us here. The officers involved cannot separate themselves from this simple truth. To get the job done, Mladic relied upon Generals Milovanović, Miletić, Gvero, and Tolimir. There were other generals in his main staff, but none of them were as close to Mladic and therefore not as powerful as these four men. The main staff knew the horrors of forcing a people to leave their homeland, and yet they all did their part to achieve it. It is unthinkable that in July 1995, any general in the main staff had not become fully involved in Mladic's campaign to remove the Muslim population from eastern Bosnia. The facts of this case will make this abundantly clear. In 1995, General Mladic and his main staff looked to their corps and brigade commanders to command the troops in defeating the enemy and removing the Muslim population from their homes. For the Srebrenica genocide and the movement of the Muslim population, General Mladic and his main staff relied principally on General Krstić. As you're aware, General Krstić stands convicted by this court of aiding and abetting genocide. In turn, the main staff and General Krstić relied upon Colonel Vinko Pandurević, Radivoj Blagojević, Major Dragan Obrenović, Ljubomir Borovčanin, and other commanders to defeat the Muslim forces, remove the Muslim population. I'll slow down. And murder the able-bodied men of Srebrenica. Major Obrenović has pled guilty in this court for doing just that. Main staff units, such as the 10th Sabotage Detachment, assisted in this awful process. 10th Sabotage soldier, Dragan Nikolić, has pled guilty to his involvement in these crimes. The majority of the work in supervising, organizing, coordinating, and facilitating the actual removal of the Muslim population from Srebrenica and Žepa, and the murder of the able-bodied men from Srebrenica fell to the security officers. For the main staff, Colonel Ljubiša Beara. For the command of the Drina Corps, Lieutenant Colonel Vujadin Popović. For the command of the Bratunac Brigade, Captain Ljubomir Nikolić. For the command of the Zvornik Brigade, Lieutenant Drago Nikolić. And his associate and assistant Milorad Trbić. Ljubomir Nikolić has pled guilty to these crimes. For Žepa, General Tolimir himself was assigned by Mladic to present and be involved in the attack on Žepa and the removal of its Muslim population. He was assisted in this briefly by Gvero, Pandurević, and security officers Beara and Popović, and others. We will begin the prosecution by bringing into court a few of the amazing men and boys that survived the mass executions. Without them, the heart of this story cannot be told. We will move on to the former chief of the Srebrenica investigation, Jean-René Ruiz, then to the Dutch battalion soldiers, experts, Bosnian Serb witnesses, and actual video footage. And finally, ending with a discussion of the guts of this case, the linkages. None of us will be left untouched by this trial. It will likely be the most important case we will ever try. But the focus of the prosecution will not be the events and the crime base. These crimes are etched into the terrible history of the Bosnian War. The crimes have never been in serious dispute. We will therefore focus this case on the evidence linking these accused to these crimes. The linkage evidence will come largely from three main sources. The first being documents. Most criminal orders in wartime are given orally, and most of the important relevant military and MOOP documents have been destroyed or hidden. However, there are some crucial VRS and MOOP documents that will help expose this crime and each of the accused in this courtroom. Number two, intercepts. You will also see the text of radio intercepts taken down by the Muslim army as they eavesdropped on the VRS and MOOP conversations. You will hear all about the process used by the VIH army, and I am confident you'll find this evidence reliable and credible. And they should form an important part of your judgment. Now, you will not be hearing audio of these conversations. Audio does not exist for the vast majority of them. What you will see are transcripts, and you'll hear about the process where the Muslim operators listened carefully to conversations, and when they heard a conversation, they started taping it, and they would usually get it right in the beginning. They would tape several conversations like this, go to a side room, and carefully transcribe that tape and listen to it over and over again until they had the transcription written down. Then that would be saved in handwritten notebooks and then sent out over their intelligence email network and saved in transcripts. And the tapes were used over and over again. They didn't have enough tapes. This will be evidence that will be very important for this case. And of course, testimony. Now, some over 10 years after these events, there's many more people, many more Serbs that are willing to talk about the events. And many of the VRS and MOOP witnesses will directly implicate one or more of the accused of the crime. As you see at the end of our witness list, long lists of VRS and MOOP people. Each of these are on that list because they go to the acts or conduct of the accused. But a word of caution here. Many of these witnesses will be adverse witnesses. Many of these witnesses will not be telling you the full truth. Many of the witnesses will go back and forth. However, with your knowledge of the case and your experience, I'm confident that you will be able to glean the truth from these witnesses. And in fact, even in lies, you can find the truth. Let me give you one example. You'll be hearing from one MOOP supervisor under the command of Mr. Borovčanin. He will acknowledge that he was in Podachari. He will acknowledge he was under the command of Borovčanin. He will lay out the command structure and largely the locations of where his troops were situated. This is extremely valuable information for all of us. Yet at the same time, he will largely look at you from this chair and say that he never saw anybody separated in Podachari, even though he was there for 2 days. Now, I think there is something to be had from this witness, even though he's a bold-faced liar, and I think we gleaned something from his bold-faced lie. Why? Can't he tell about the separations? Simply, it was a crime. All right. I want to talk a little bit about the charges. Despite a massive indictment that got bigger and bigger, I try to break the basic indictment down into basically it's the two horrendous crimes that the prosecutor mentioned. The forced movement of the Muslim population and the misery and death resulting from that, and two, the mass murder of the thousands of Bosnian Muslim men and boys. Put these together, you get genocide. Now, it's important to point out, and something that you know, but that is a continuing theme with the witnesses especially, is that forced movement is not just about moving the people out. That when done with the knowledge that this is the eventual aim, it involves 1, strangling the enclaves by limiting the crucial supplies. 2, terrorizing the civilian population by sniping and shelling. 3, attacking the civilian population during the assault on the enclaves. And 4, moving them out on buses and trucks, or scaring them out by foot, boat, and as you'll see, wheelbarrows attached to logs. Substantial involvement in any one or combination of these, with the knowledge of the overall plan to remove the population, in our view, makes an accused criminally responsible. In addition, as set out clearly in the indictment, substantial involvement in an otherwise legal act with the knowledge that such action substantially assists the criminal objective and the intent to do so also makes an accused criminally liable. This is especially true at the high level we're talking about, Generals Gvero and Miletić. For example, when Gvero and Miletić, as part of the overall plan to remove the Muslim population, take part in defeating UNPROFOR with the aim to getting at the population, that makes them guilty because they're part, it's an overall part and an integral connected link to the overall criminal objective. Now, the attack on the enclave may not have to be completely illegal, as we'll get into later. Clearly, the Muslims were creating a situation that would have allowed the Serbs to attack them and attack the Muslim army. But that does not justify an attack directed towards civilian targets with the overall additional objective to move out the Muslim population. Mass murder. It's crucial to understand that genocide and mass murder is much more than just an order from Karadzic and Mladic and then the people on the ground shooting. This is something that I'm sure the judges understand, but you'll see from the witnesses that they pretend they don't in many respects. When committed with the knowledge that victims would be killed, the commission of mass murder involves all of the following in equal measure. I'm talking about mass murder as developed in Europe at the end of this century. It involves this: capturing the Muslim men, detaining the men, transporting the men to detention sites, detaining the men in pre-execution detention sites, transporting the men to the execution sites, executing the men, and disposing of the men. This is the crime of mass murder. We are all familiar with the crime of drugs and the crime of bank robbery and the other crimes, and we know how those work. But when someone takes part in any of these activities, knowing it's leading to the death and the murder of people, especially at the officer level, they are part of the program. Any person substantially participating in any of these activities must be found responsible. As a member of a joint criminal enterprise intending the outcome is one way, or as an aider and abettor who has knowledge of the crime and substantially assists in its commission. To drive home the point that these crimes are not just about shooters and Mladic or Karadzic or Milosevic, I want to read you the testimony of a young survivor from the Petkovsky Dam executions, witness O from the Krstić trial. He's also a young kid that, remember the prosecutor's quote of the imam. This guy pulled himself out of beneath some 1,000 people, 500 to 1,000 people, and along with a colleague, even though wounded, managed to survive in the woods and escape. And when he testified in the Krstić trial, this is what he said. From all of whatever I have said and what I saw, I could come to the conclusion that this was extremely well organized. It was systematic killing, and that the organizers of that do not deserve to be at liberty. And if I had the right and the courage, in the name of all those innocents and all those victims, I would forgive the actual perpetrators of the executions because they were misled. Witness O's organizers. They're in court today with us. That's the focus of this tribunal. That's the focus of this case. In order to understand Srebrenica and identify those responsible for the crimes, I've always divided this case into roughly 3 chapters. And I will spend the next few hours going over those chapters with you. The first chapter I call the history leading up to the attack on Srebrenica. It's important to understand the big picture, the historical background, the people, the places, and the events leading up to the attack on Srebrenica and Žepa enclaves in July 1995. And as part of the first chapter, I think we need to have a basic understanding of the makeup and organization of the Army and police forces involved. I'm not going to spend a lot of detail on that. I would refer you, when we get there, to the reports of Rick Butler and the various officers as they testify, VRS officers included. But I'll go over a few of the, what I think are the important issues that you should bear in mind from the beginning of the case. Chapter 2, the fall in Srebrenica and Žepa. These are the events, largely from 10 July through roughly 19 July, where the population has moved out and the men and boys were killed. Then chapter 3 is what I call direct linkage. And in that chapter, I will take documents and intercepts and some discussion of witnesses, but not many, and discuss each of the accused and show you those documents that, when they finally do come into this case, will point at each of the accused and implicate the accused in a significant way. And I'll go over those with you at the end of my opening statement. I notice we have a break in 5 minutes. Before we get into chapter 1, might be a good idea to take a break.
Whenever it's convenient for you, Mr. McCloskey.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. President. Now would be a convenient
Okay, that's
time.
perfect. So we'll have 20 minutes from now. Thank you.
All right, 5 ongeveer. All eyes, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated.
Yes, Mr. McCloskey. The next break will be scheduled for 12:30. Of course, you're free to ask to have the break earlier or a little bit later, should it be more convenient for you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. All right, I will now get into the sort of the briefest history to the lead up of the events that are in question. And I think it's first important for us to just take a look at the map of Bosnia. And that should be on the screen. Right now. As you can see, the area within the green is the BIH. Sorry, this is a little fuzzy on my picture, but and it's important to note Serbia off to the right of the screen, and the area in the pink is the Drinakor zone of responsibility where these events largely occurred. It's important to see this area of I've referred to as Eastern Bosnia. It's also referred to as the Podrinja area or the Drina River Valley, but it's an important area. If you could keep that screen up for me. It's an important strategic area for all sides. If we could get this, did the screen go off on everyone's or just mine? Well, in any event, the show must go on. So I'll continue. In the spring of 1992, the tensions inside and outside Bosnia are pretty extreme. The sides are beginning to form. And this particular area is of important strategic value. And to get an idea of its importance, both strategically and from an ethnic point of view, as this first and foremost, unfortunately, began as an ethnic conflict, I want to go to an exhibit from the 12th May 1992 Bosnian Serb Assembly called The Six Strategic Objectives, and talk about them a bit. At this assembly hearing, the matters were discussed about moving populations and ethnic populations. And you can see from this directive the ominous tone that this war would take. And if we could blow it up to especially so we can see strategic number 1. And that is, and I'll read it slowly, establish state borders separating the Serbian people from the other two ethnic communities. Now, this is an outrageous thing to actually attempt to separate ethnic communities. And we'll see just how difficult that was. But they're right up front in this document, and they talk about it. So we see very early on that this war was going to be a war with ethnic motivations, relying on old ethnic hatreds fomenting them. Then look at number 3, it gives you an idea of how important this area was. Establish a corridor in the Drina River Valley, that is, eliminate the Drina as a border separating Serbian states. Now, you saw the Drina River in the previous map. It was bordering on the Podrinja, or Drina River Valley, and so this would separate that and make this part a part of Mother Serbia, indicating this strategic nature of this area. Now, to give you an idea of the ethnic makeup and the ethnic foundation of this conflict, I want to quote you General Mladić's comments, very briefly, that he made at this assembly hearing that led to the promulgation of the 6 strategic objectives. He says, and this is after having some experience in the war of 1991 in Croatia, people and peoples are not pawns, nor are they keys in one's pocket that can be shifted from here to there. It is something easily said, but difficult to achieve. And he goes on in another part. Therefore, we cannot cleanse, nor can we have a sieve to sift, so that only Serbs would stay, or that the Serbs would fall through and the rest leave. Then he goes on and says, I do not know how Mr. Krajnik and Mr. Karadzic would explain this to the world. People, that would be genocide, unquote. General Mladić, of all people, forecasting the event, but recognizing that moving people from their homeland, the Bosnian people, from the villages they lived in for centuries, was not going to be easy. It was going to involve bloodshed. Shortly after this meeting, the war in Bosnia, especially in eastern Bosnia, broke out in earnest. It began in the north, in the area of Bijeljina, worked its way south through Zvornik, Bratanac. These events in the spring of '92 were events notable for their terror and their attacks on civilian population. There were troops from Serbia, paramilitary and others that were involved in this. Not only were the Muslim forces routed, but the civilians, who were largely outnumbered, the Serbs, were shoved and pushed from their homes ever south, down towards the area of Srebrenica. Now the BIH in the early days fought back, being led by Nasser Oric and his own particular brand of horror, managed to make some inroads against the VRS. And in November of 1992, Mladić, Karadzic, made what I refer to as a supreme act of arrogance and impunity, and set out the plan to deal with the Muslims in eastern Bosnia. And if we could go now to Operational Directive 4 of November 1992. And in particular, I'd like to blow up section D, page 5 of the English. And as we're doing that, I'll read it to you. There were some 9 directives done by Mladić and Karadzic throughout the wartime period. They were important documents. They were sent out to all the corps to outline their objectives, their strategies, and provide them the basic tasks by which they were to work. And if we go to page 5 here and look to the Drinacore section, I will read the appropriate, the relevant part. The Drinacore. From its present positions, its main forces shall persistently defend Visegrad, the dam, Zvornik, and the corridor, while the rest of its forces in the wider Podrinja region shall exhaust the enemy, inflict the heaviest possible losses on him, and force him to leave Birac, Žepa, and the Garajte areas. Now that's war. That's fine. That's what war is all about. Inflict the heaviest losses possible on the enemy and drive them out. But listen to this last sentence. After they want to inflict the losses on the enemy, force him to leave the Birac, Žepa, and Garajte areas together with the Muslim population. There it is, black and white, what Mladić had predicted in a secret document. It's called what we now refer to as ethnic cleansing. Move out the Muslim population. Black and white. There it is. Unbelievable. Impunity. Now, as we know from historical fact, the VRS came fighting back. The Muslim forces were being beaten back. And in the spring of 1993, all was practically lost for the Muslims. They had been herded down in the area of Srebrenica, Žepa. And right as the VRS was coming in to make their final attack, General Morion stepped in with the United Nations and somehow stopped the onslaught, and the enclaves were created, for better or for worse. Now, the enclaves were supposed to be demilitarized. They never really were. The meager UN forces that were sent there tried. They were able to get, I think, a tank, the only tank that was known to have some of the heavier weapons. But the army, the structure remained intact inside the enclave. They had some automatic weapons, a lot of hunting rifles, and they were able to hold a ragtag military force together that led attacks outside the enclave. And so for the next 2 years, we have this situation where from the Muslim side, Nasser Oric and the BIH army are attacking outside the enclave, largely in order to tie down troops from other areas of the war and in part to feed themselves, because for the Serb side of it, they were cutting off the enclaves and restricting their humanitarian support. In the early years of this, we're not going to spend a lot of time in the case, but you will hear from 1 or 2 Canadian battalion members to talk about this. But this is not where our indictment starts, but it's important to have some understanding of that. By the time we get to July 1995, we actually see a Muslim document establishing the policy for the BIH army to attack the Serbs out of the enclave in order to tie down the Serbs from going to the Sarajevo front, which in 95 was the major front for the Serbs. And that's precisely what the BIH was doing. So there was some justification to go into Srebrenica by the Serb army and take out this threat. We'll get at that a little bit later. However, when we look at it, the overall objective, the motive to move out the civilian population, it's a 2-part plan. One that may have some legitimacy, and the other that absolutely does not. Now, I'd like to take you to another exhibit to take us a little more into July 1994. It's a report to the members of the Bratanats Brigade, which is stationed right to the north of the enclave. And it basically sets out the strategy on dealing with the enclaves. Now, remember, and we'll get into this in more detail, but you have the main staff, the corps, and the brigades. When you see a strategy like this from a brigade, it's not coming out of the origin of the brigade commander's head. This is the kind of thing that he will receive direction from above, and he will pass it down to his troops below. But in any event, the brigade that had most of the responsibility for Srebrenica, and if we could go to page 3, it's the last paragraph in paragraph 2 in the English. And as we get there, I'll read it. If we could blow it up so we can, especially with eyes that are not as young as they used to be, if we could blow it up a little more. But the relevant part says, "There will be no retreat when it comes to the Srebrenica enclave. We must advance. The enemy's life has to be made unbearable, and their temporary stay in the enclave impossible, so that they leave the enclave en masse as soon as possible, realizing that they cannot survive there." Again, we see the policy set out that will eventually lead to the attack on the enclave and gives us the foundation of why we see the sniping, the shelling, and the restriction of the material, all of which is happening now, but will happen when our case starts as well in March of '95. Okay, if we leave '94, we get into March of 1995, specifically the 17th of March. I think at this point, all sides can see that the war won't be lasting forever, and that if gains are going to be made, they best be made this year. The Croatians were looking to the Bosnian Serb Krajina, and this was the major threat that everyone saw coming, is a massive Croatian front to the north. This is where General Milovanović was assigned for a good part of the year. So General Milovanović is not present during much of the time, and therefore not on our radar screen, though he is a very important figure in all of this. He was Mladić's top guy, and when Mladić had a most serious threat, he sent Milovanović there. He did that with his other generals too. He would send Gvero to Srebrenica, to the forward command post. He sent Tolomir to the Žepa forward command post. This is how he commanded. Now, Milovanović was way off in the Krajina during most of this, leaving General Miletić to be standing in for the Chief of Staff. In any event, by this time, the Bosnian Serb Supreme Command and military understood that it's now time to solve the issue with the enclaves. If they're going to make them all Serbian, now's the time to do it. So if we could go to Operational Directive 7, dated 17 March 1995. Okay, and on that I'd like to go again to the Drina Corps section. And by the way, as you'll see at the end of this document, it was drafted by then Colonel Miletić, accused in this case. I'll get into that a little more detail later when I get to some of the documents associated with General Miletić in particular. But the part I want to particularly note to you In the middle of the paragraph under the Drina Corps, it states, while in the direction, and I quote, while in the direction of Srebrenica and Žepa enclaves, complete physical separation of Srebrenica from Žepa should be carried out as soon as possible, preventing even communication between individuals in the two enclaves. Well, this is military. The Žepa and the Srebrenica enclaves were militarily supporting each other. Items were being flown in secret helicopter missions from the BIH army and creating havoc within the ranks of the villages outside the enclaves and causing the VRS to tie down hundreds of troops around those enclaves away from the Sarajevo front, which was a crucial front. So this part of it is military and is legitimate. By planned and well thought out combat operations, create an unbearable situation of total insecurity with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica and Žepa. Again, we're going directly to the civilian population. The inhabitants, there can be no doubt what this means. It's a follow-up on what we see throughout the historical period that I've been mentioning. Right there in black and white, drafted by General Miletić himself. Now, that gets us to where our indictment begins. But before I get to those events, there's a few issues, military issues mostly, that I'd like to discuss that I think you need to have in mind as you look at the case. I would first tell you that by 1995, the VRS was a professional army. It was based on the rules and regulations of the JNA, which was one of the best armies and most professional armies in Eastern Europe. It had clear foundations from the Geneva Conventions. The training its officers received, by all accounts in my review of it, was excellent. Mr. Pandurević, General Pandurević was trained in the Geneva Conventions, as were the other professional officers in this group. They knew the difference between right and wrong. They knew what they were doing. These rules of the former JNA were promulgated by the RS early on, and you can see those rules in Mr. Butler's report. They clearly set out the Geneva Conventions. They actually anticipate an international tribunal and show respect towards that. They had some good lawyers in the early days of the main staff. Unfortunately, that material, that foundation of the honor of the Serb soldier was never followed, was cast aside. Once they took on the cloak of ethnic war, those that chose to take part of it set aside their honor and began a war against the populations of the Muslims. Now, they had a military prosecutor back then as well, and they promulgated guidelines for determining the criteria of criminal prosecution. If we could go to that. This is dated in 1992, and the part I want to show you in English is on page 7, the third paragraph down, and I'll read it slowly. I think it's that important. It's under a paragraph entitled Criminal Offenses Against Humanity and International Law, pursuant to Chapter 16 of the Criminal Code. Crimes against humanity and international law can be committed by individuals acting on their own, but by their nature, these criminal offenses are usually committed in an organized fashion in the implementation of the policy of the ruling circles. Witness O's organizers. Most of these criminal offenses are committed only during armed conflicts or are in some way closely connected with armed conflicts, which means that they are committed within the context of the broad military operations and on orders from superior officers. There's no way I could have or anyone else could have said it any better. And this is coming from the main staff. They go on to talk about the responsibility of a soldier, especially of those of commanders. And I'd go to the top of page 8. From this follows the explicit responsibility of the officer corps of the Army of Republika Srpska as the giver of orders in command of the armed forces, whose members could commit or are committing some of these offenses, to take uncompromising action and prevent such conduct. This responsibility belongs by its nature particularly to high-ranking individuals and officials in state, military, or public organizations who are in the concrete circumstances in a position to issue orders. These are commanders. Commanders are the only ones that actually issue or originate orders. In this case, General Vinko Pandurević, Deputy Commander Ljubomir Borovčanin. I'll talk about the powers and the ability to pass on orders and originate orders of the others soon. And we'll go on with this quote. If officers merely find out that units of the armed forces of the Army of Republika Srpska or their members have committed or are committing such acts and take no measures to prevent the consequences or the acts themselves and expose perpetrators to criminal prosecution, this in itself makes them answerable for these criminal offenses. They don't prevent it. They're responsible for those criminal offenses. Does that sound familiar? Article 7.3. But this is much more than a failure to prevent case. And you'll see this from the facts. When Vinko Pandurević arrives back to his brigade in the middle of the day on 15 July, there's still some 1,500 people left to murder. And when he comes back, he again is the man in charge on the ground in total command. The people of the Zvornik Brigade are acting under his command when he returns. Ljubiša Beara is there, but he is not a commander. He has no power to command. He is what I've referred to before as an empty vessel. He is only as good as he is filled up by the orders of General Mladić, which he was. And he's carrying them out. He and the other security officers have to get their authority through their commander to obtain the troops and the other machinery necessary to get this job done. But when Vinko Pandurević returns, he takes on command. He takes on the responsibility of what he absolutely knows is going on, and he knows it. The same holds true with Ljubomir Borovčanin, who has told us in a statement to the ICTY that he was present at Kravica when the massacres were going on, and he did nothing. He took a man with burned hands.
Your Honor, I really hate to interrupt my learned colleague in giving his opening statement, but we intend to object to the admittance of Mr. Borovčanin's interview, and I believe it will be unfair to quote this in the opening statement.
Go ahead, and we will deal with the objection even when it arises. Thank you.
Mr. Borovčanin told the ICTY that he was at the Kravica warehouse while the massacres were going on. And he did nothing but take one of his officers who had burned hands to Bratunac. After that, some 500 to 800, maybe more, men were murdered. And his groups, his troops, were in control of that area and taking part in those murders. Much more than a failure to prevent. You have seen that we have charged in this indictment under a law that requires a commander in an area that he controls to protect prisoners of war. Not just his own troops, but from anyone that will do them harm. He failed in his duty to do that, therefore he's criminally liable. He's also part of the overall joint criminal enterprise, knew that this was a mass murder that was part of an organized plan. You'll see his discussions with Krstić after this fact. You'll see other massacres that his troops were in. You'll see what his troops were doing in Potocari. But I bring this particular section up because it's so important to these two commanders, directly to them. There's another significant rule that was promulgated by Karadzic, which had much more importance than the rule I just mentioned. It's entitled The Interim Provisions on the Service of the Army of the Serb Republic, 18 August 1992. And it says, members of the army shall carry out orders of their superior without demur, in full, accurately, and punctually. This is what won out in the day, though as I will discuss later on. General Pandurević and all the rest had received training that they had absolutely no obligation to follow criminal orders. In fact, it was a direct violation of their duty, their honor, as soldiers, to follow such orders. They knew what they were to do. They were to stand down. All right, now if we could talk very briefly about the basic command structure, and if I could go to the exhibit chart for the main staff. Again, I don't want to get into details at this time. I leave that to the reports of Mr. Butler. And if you could try to blow that up so that we see the top half of it. Sorry, we're left in the electronic age, and basically this is a chart that puts Ratko Mladić as the commander of the VRS on the top. General Milovanović is his chief of staff. Now, he is the person that is in charge with coordinating the other areas of the command and making sure that the orders of General Mladić get carried out, and acting as General Mladić's main advisor. He's Mladić's right-hand man. He's not a commander, but he's close to it, and I'll explain how that works. The next box is under the sheet. First of all, on the right are the assistant commanders. Now, assistant commanders are high-ranking officers that are experts in particular fields. And for example, the fields that we're talking about, Tolomir is intelligence and security, Gvero, legal, religious, and moral. And there are others, logistics. And then there are the staff officers, who are the staff of the chief of staff, and there's various branches within that. In particular, we have the operations department, where during most of this time. We had Colonel Miletić and then General Miletić as the Chief of Operations. This job also held the position of a Deputy Chief of Staff. And so in the absence of Miletić would take over. And as I mentioned, Milanović was in the Krajina for a good part of this. And so the documents that we see throughout 1995 are largely in the hand of General Miletić, who is standing in for the Chief of Staff. Now, as I said, assistant commanders are experts in the field. What they do is they make proposals for the commander regarding their various fields. The commander reviews those proposals, makes his own orders based on them, and then it's the job of the assistant commander to facilitate the commander's orders, make sure they get done, make sure that it goes down through the chain and gets done. And fundamentally, while this is probably a very basic approach to this subject, this is the way it worked in the Corps and in the brigade. The fundamental difference is the main staff had very few people and only had a couple of units under arms, the 65th Protection Regiment and the 10th Sabotage Detachment being the ones that are most relevant to this case. Now, an assistant commander may pass on the orders of his commander, or he may issue, well, not issue, that's the wrong word. If you say that to a military man, he will grimace. He will make orders that are consistent with his commander's orders originally, and they get passed down through the ranks. He doesn't have the power to originate and issue orders. Therefore, he doesn't have the power to prevent people from committing crimes, because in order to do that, that's not backed up. He doesn't have that power. But he passes on the order of his commander, or he makes an order consistent with the order of his commanders, and it has the same effect as if a commander had made it, especially for the soldier or the officer that's receiving it on the other side. And you will see several examples of this happening. Colonel Beara cannot originate orders, but when he wants troops, he has to go, in this case, to General Krstić, asking General Krstić for troops, even though Beara is from the main staff. And you'll see this later on. Colonel Beara has to say, but Fertula, another brigade commander, is not following the general's orders, meaning Mladić. So Beara has power that is gained through his association and orders provided him by his commander, Mladić. And that's the way it works for all these guys down the line. Now, I mentioned briefly about General Miletić and his role. He was the operations, chief of operations. Now, the chief of operations is a person that is a hands-on guy involved in the operation, the military operations of the Corps and the brigade. So he is not a logistician and the more technical aspects of it. He is a hands-on guy and connected to these various operations. And so he is a key player in any military organization. And when he becomes standing in for Milanović, try to explain what that means. There's a couple of different designations that the VRS had. They had acting, and they had, you could be an acting chief of staff, or you could be standing in for the chief of staff. Now, the basic difference to this is that when someone becomes an acting chief of staff, he's taking on much more of the cloak of that job. And that is in a situation not just in the mere absence or unavailability of the chief of staff. It's normally when that chief of staff is in the hospital or unavailable or has been dismissed or killed. And this person is standing in, this person is acting, and it doesn't have all the aspects of the job itself because it's assumed to be temporary. But it is much more so than standing in. Standing in is when is something that happens in the absence of the person, such as when Milovanović is still in the army, still in Bosnia, still in communications. He's just far away, engaged up to his eyeballs with the Krajina. So that's the case where Miletić becomes standing in for the chief of staff and takes on many of his duties. In fact, almost all his daily duties. Milovanović can't do it. And you'll see what those are. So that's an important distinction to have in mind as you look at this. Now, commander. It's the same thing, though it's a little different in this situation. I'll use the Zvornik Brigade example. In the commander, we see that there is, first of all and foremost, the commander who's normally present in command, on duty. Then there is the deputy commander, who at the same time is the chief of staff. Milovanović was the deputy commander at the same time he was the chief of staff, but he only became deputy commander when Mladić was absent or available, which was almost never, even when he was in Serbia, that was not absent. So we don't see Milovanović being deputy commander much. But if we go to the Zvornik Brigade, we see that Vinko Pandurević frequently goes out on military assignments. His Drina Wolves are the best attack group in the Drina Corps, and he's out on various duties, not infrequently. And we see from the evidence two things happening. Sometimes when he seems like he's gone on a more permanent basis or is fully involved in something well outside the brigade, Dragan Obrenović has become the acting commander, meaning that he bears almost the entire cloak of command because Vinko Pandurević is unavailable to a significant degree. But in other situations, such as when we see Vinko Pandurević go down to take part in the attack on Srebrenica or the attack on Žepa, we see Dragan Obrenović designated as the deputy commander. This is what he takes on in the absence or the unavailability of the commander. Now, this is an important distinction because the deputy commander, while in command of the troops on the ground and responsible for what's going on in his zone of responsibility, his commander is still in command of him and still has command responsibility. So when Vinko Pandurević is in Srebrenica, he does not give up his complete responsibility over his brigade. Basically, a deputy commander is trusted enough, as Obrenović was, to run the show and do the policies and get the job done as his commander had set the tone. Because this is temporary, that is possible. But the deputy commander is not one to originate policy or originate commands, and if something comes up where the deputy commander must originate or be creative or something outside the area of his commander or something he knows his commander did not agree with, he will call his commander and check with him to make sure. And his commander is always available, always has a radio man with him, can get to a post. This war was not fought such that people are pinned down for days at a time out of communication. It gets a little crazier in the 15th and 16th, and we'll get into that in detail. But Vinko Pandurević was always by a radio, always near a forward command post, and always reachable. And in the context of his deputy commander would be contacting him when he had to. That's the basic rules that you'll see. Okay, the security branch. The security branch is just one of the expert branches under each of the, whether it be the main staff, the corps, or the brigade. And the security branch basically has two responsibilities, and it works for each one of them. They have responsibilities associated with law enforcement, where they're dealing with largely with the military police and enforcing the laws related to military conduct. And practically, a lot of this tended to deal with soldiers that left the lines, deserters, and rounding them up and making sure that the military police dealt with this properly, and that the military police were organized and acting according to the rules. Now, that's part of their job. They were not in command of the military police. The military police were under the command of the commander of the brigade or corps. The security officer was their director and their supervisor in very clearly established activities related to the military police. And the commanders would allow them to do that with full knowledge of what they were doing. And critical to this case is that military police are in charge of prisoners. So it's very natural that the dealing with the prisoners fell to the military police and the security officers. That's why you see all the security officers sitting here today. They were in charge of dealing with the prisoners. Now, they're not commanders, but they had orders from their commanders. And they were able to give orders pursuant to their commander's orders. And they were able to direct and supervise the military police in carrying out those duties. And that's the way it worked. Now, there's another side of the security branch that you need to be aware of, because they have a two-part job. One, law enforcement. Clearly, they have to report everything to their commander. Commander knows what's going on. It's just like any normal situation. The second one is counterintelligence. And this is unique to this branch. A security officer has responsible for counterintelligence. Now, what does that mean? In this context, it mostly means threats from within, internal threats, threats against the command, threats against the army, soldiers being traitors, soldiers dealing with the other parts of the enemy, espionage. That's counterintelligence. Now, for counterintelligence, there are no troops. He has no men. It's him, basically, the security officer. Sometimes he'll get help from the intelligence officer. They work very closely in matters of intelligence and counterintelligence. That's why when you'll see that the intelligence officers are very closely related to the security officers and are wrapped up in this thing quite a bit themselves. So one is counterintelligence and one is law enforcement. Now, what goes along with the counterintelligence side are certain privileges that make the security job different than anyone else's. And that is because the security officer has the right to investigate the commander. He can receive information from his other security officers, the ones up the professional chain of command, secretly. And that's has been defined in the regulations. Drago Nikolić is allowed to get secret communications from Popović or Beara that he can read and Pandurević cannot read. This drives commanders crazy. It drove Pandurević crazy because commanders want to know and be in control of what happens. But naturally, when a security officer may be investigating a commander or dealing with very sensitive information that may, if it becomes known to the command staff, infringe upon one of his counterintelligence jobs, then there's it's obvious a need for some secrecy for that to be carried out. Now, the regulations also clearly say they allow that, they understand that, but they say that when it is appropriate, the security officer must tell his commander what's going on. So the security officer may have an operation to ferret out a traitor, and he may not have to tell the commander what he's doing when he's going to go interview that person. But after the interview, when the thing is sorted out, he's got to tell his commander what's going on. And he's got to tell his commander he's going there. He can't just go to the front line to interview someone and show up. That would mess up the commander's ability to run a proper service. So this is a tension that we see throughout the VRS. It's a normal tension. Now, as we may see from the defense, we have seen commanders attempting to blame all the murders on the security branch and suggest that they're running the show, that they're in command. Well, this is impossible in the VRS regulatory scheme of things. There's only, 4 or 5 security officers for the entire Army, and they can't possibly run anything by themselves. They need to rely on the commanders for the men, the material, the troops, all that's involved in this mad mess. But when we get into this give and take between commanders and security officers, you'll need to have the basic understanding of how the system works. You'll hear that from the witnesses themselves. We'll go through it to the degree that it is necessary. At this point, I can't glean much from the defense briefs to see if this is necessary. In the past, it's been an important topic. And as I mentioned, it's the job of the security officer to help direct and supervise the military police. In this case, under the main staff, this unit of armed men, the 65th Protection Regiment, designed to protect main staff assets, had a military police contingent to it. And as such, Beara had responsibility over them. Not command responsibility, but supervisory responsibility. However, going back to the practical aspect of this, you'll see a Dutch soldier, Egbers, who was in Nova Kasaba on the 13th or 14th, and was introduced to Colonel Beara by the commander of the military police unit there at Nova Kasaba, and the commander Milan introduced Beara as here's my commander, Colonel Beara. Well, that's not technically correct, but from Milanich's point of view, what Beara said went, and you'll see that in practice. Popović, there was a Drina military police unit that he directed. And the brigades generally got to know Popović because he's not far away in Vlasenica, and he made visits to the brigade. So the brigade military police commanders knew him and of course listened to him when he was working with their security officers. In the case of Zvornik, Lieutenant Drago Nikolić had the Zvornik Brigade military police company that he directed. And in Bratanac, we had Captain Momir Nikolić directing the military police company of the platoon of the Bratanac Brigade. Platoon meaning it's a smaller number of men, I believe in the area of 50. Company was supposed to be more in the area of 200. I may have gotten those figures not exact at this point. Okay. special police, an issue related to the special police that you need to be aware of. The Ministry of Interior is divided, well, roughly, it has armed forces, first of all. And their first line of armed forces were the special police, which were divided into regions. And these were some of the top people that originally trained in riot control and that kind of thing. And this is where Mr. Borovčanin was as deputy commander. Their units were basically combat units throughout the war that were assigned to work in combat areas. And when they were assigned with the Army, they became under the command of the Army, which I'll get into a little bit later. Additionally, the Minister of Interior had other combat units related to the police districts that were different than the special police districts. These are basically the civilian police districts, what is referred to as CSBs. Now, the CSB we're talking about is CSB Zvornik, which included most of this broad area that we're talking about. And the CSB Zvornik had many civilian police officers, traffic officers, detectives, of course. And in a time of war, it was only natural that those men were used when needed. So they had divided up the CSB into 6 potential companies. These were call-up companies. They were not always on the front line, but they were usually doing their job, doing traffic control or whatever, but in certain situations they would get called up and used by the Army or the Ministry of Interior. And these units we call the PJP units. So we have Borovčanin's special police units and the CSB PJP units. Now, the reason we use these initials PJP is very important, actually, is why I bring it up. The word in Bosnian that represents the letter P is translated in English as special. And so you'll see many documents with the special police of the CSB, and then you'll see special police of the Ministry of Interior, and it can get confusing. So, and that's just a problem of translation. In Bosnian, special police, the word is something, and forgive me, but something related to special. It sounds like special. The word that starts with a P, I've forgotten it, but it's different. And so this distinction has to be made. It'll drive the members of the MOOP as they're on the stand crazy if we mix this up. So we have to use these initials PJP for the municipal police, and we use special police for the special police. Sorry for that long instruction, but with these witnesses, it's very important. They obviously take it very seriously, as I know Mr. Borovčanin does. Now, another important area related to this is when the special police or the PJP units are assigned to a combat operation that the Army is in, the government of the Republika Srpska recognized that this created a problem of command. And so early on, they designated special rules that when this happened, that you had to get the approval of the Minister of Interior and the President. And once that happened, then the MOOP officers and MOOP soldiers became under the command of the Army that they were assigned to. Now, how did this work? This rule especially points this out, so that when Borovčanin is assigned by the Minister of Interior to go to General Krstić and report to him in Bratunac on the 11th of July, he becomes under the command of the Army. Now, I don't have the President's approval of that, but we do have the evidence to show you that that's what's happened. And the way that works is Borovčanin takes his orders from the Army, but the rules also clearly set out that the MOOP commanders retain command and their command chain stays the same. So you don't have an army guy going behind Borovčanin's back and giving an order. The rules are Borovčanin gives the orders, they go down through his chain of command, he receives them through the army. Now, of course, in the practical battlefield, things don't always work out the way as planned, but that's the way the rules work, that's the way they tried to make them work, and that's the way they did work. Feels like you've been listening to me for a long time, and that this information is not the easiest to listen to. I now am time to go into chapter 2. I don't know if
yes,
you want me to keep talking or make
it's
a
up.
break.
It's up to you, Mr. McCloskey. We're certainly not going to stop you. I previously told you that the next break was scheduled for 12:30. In reality, I think we are to stick to the hour and a half schedule. It should be at 12:15 or thereabout. So please regulate yourself accordingly. I mean, according to your exigencies. Whenever you need to stop, we'll give you the opportunity to do so.
Thank you. This is a natural stopping point, and I don't think people should have to listen to me for more than 45 minutes at a time.
Right. Then we'll have a 20-minute break starting from now. Thank you.
Thank you.
All rise, 5 voor de V. All rise, 5 voor de V. Please be seated.
Mr. McCloskey, I know that the first 38 minutes of today's sittings was dedicated to something else. So you had 38 minutes less. Do you think you would be able to finish your opening statement today?
No, Mr. President, as I look at it and as I realize the pace I'm going, I don't think so. I would like, if possible, to have at least a couple of hours tomorrow.
Yes. And can I then kindly ask you to stop 10 minutes before the scheduled time of 13:45, so that we'll we'll have some oral submissions on the outstanding motion on protective measures, so that will then proceed to decide it either later on today or earlier or later on tomorrow.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you. Yes, go ahead.
All right. Well, as I've stated, Chapter 2, I entitled the attack on the Srebrenica enclave. By May and June of 1995, the VRS had finally been able to engage itself to focus on the enclaves, and they developed an attack plan to do just that, and it lays out the attack and the purpose of the attack, and I would like to go to that plan to just show you one part of it that is important for what I've been saying in the theme of the case. And that is page 3 of what is entitled the Command of the Drina Corps Military Secret Krivaya 95, and basically lays out the situation, the military situation, and assigns the units that are going to be taking part. And I want to point out to you in page 3, the third paragraph from the top. If we could go to that in English. And I'll read it slowly. The command of the Drina Corps, pursuant to Operations Directive Number 7 and 7.1. Now, if you recall, Directive 7 was the one that said, make life unbearable for the inhabitants of Srebrenica. So basically, again, and I'll quote, pursuant to Operations Directive Number 7 and 7.1 of the VRS, main staff, and on the basis of the situation in the Corps area of responsibility, has the task of carrying out offensive activities with free forces deep in the Drina Corps zone as soon as possible in order to split apart the enclaves of Žepa and Srebrenica and reduce them to their urban areas. Now, as we said before, separate the enclaves is a legitimate military concern. But look at this, the last part, reduce them to their urban areas. Now, both enclaves are some 50 to 60 kilometers in diameter, and the bulk of the population of Srebrenica, which is some 30,000, perhaps even more, live outside the roughly 1 kilometer by 2 kilometer urban area. And so if you attack that enclave and you reduce it to the urban area, you are forcing some 20,000 people into a tiny area that would create an absolute humanitarian disaster. So it was the purpose of this plan to do just that. Now, if you look at the plan in more detail, you'll see that it was not the purpose of the plan to take the enclave at that time. It was the purpose to reduce it to its urban area, to create this horrible situation. And later in this document, you'll see it says, create a situation for the elimination of the enclave, and something to the effect, be prepared to act when given the opportunity, something any good any good military commander would do in the situation. And so it's important to note that while we see Directive 7 at work here, and we see the unlawful aim, they're not at that point trying to take the enclave. You'll see in other documents what they're worried about is the United Nations and NATO. There are other documents that say when the UN leaves, then take the enclave. So, like Morion in '93, with the UN there, they're worried about their view in the world, and they're not prepared to take it. It wasn't until a little later, as the events unfold, that they became willing to, and we'll get into that. All right, if we could go to, can we get to the map with the 4 S's? I'm going to skip to the end now and show you a map that was found in the Drina Corps collection. We have the original of. You won't get the full feel of it on this screen. And in fact, if we could blow it up a bit more so we can try to read the English. This is a map, an actual JNA military map of the Srebrenica enclave in the north. That looks pretty good. And the Žepa enclave in the south. This was a map that was drawn after the operations were over, and were signed and stamped as an official military map, as you can see, by Major General Radislav Krstić. And what is stated on them is interesting. Srebrenica has been Serbian and remains Serbian. Then it says in 12 July 1995. And then Žepa is also Serbian, 27 July 1995. 12 July is the day they entered Potocari, finally took the enclave. And 27 July is the date that they took Žepa. And you can see they've drawn the basic attack plan, and the red is the Serbs, the blue is the Muslims, and the little initials are for the various brigades that were involved in the attack. You'll see the Zvornik Brigade involved in both. Vinko and Pandurević and the Drina Wolves playing a major role in those. And you may also notice, if you look at this map, over the top of the map is written a big cross with 4 Cyrillic S's in it. And that, as you will likely know, is a Serbian national symbol, nationalist symbol. It's not just a national symbol. Had there been a flag on this map, a Serbian flag, well, that's one thing. This is a symbol of Serb nationalism, and those S's stand for only unity will save the Serbs. Now, this saying, only unity will save the Serbs, is in and of itself relatively harmless sounding, but it's based on the propaganda that was used from the very beginning of this war, that the Muslims were coming to kill us all. They are coming to commit genocide on us. We must fight for our survival. This is a theme you hear repeatedly in the speeches of General Mladić, General Krstić, and others. And it's the very simple propaganda as a rallying cry to not just fight, but when you believe that the opposite forces are coming to commit genocide on you, that is your first step towards the dark side. And so what do we have here? I skip to the end. Srebrenica. You can look under that cross, those 4 S's, and think of the some 7,000 people that are dead and buried under them. A little farther north in Zvornik, to be precise. And in Žepa, the people have been run out and the top leadership murdered. 3, 4, at least, people were murdered in Žepa. And so we have, as an official military map, General Krstić, who has been convicted of aiding and abetting, putting his national symbol over the top of the graves of Srebrenica. They are proud. He is proud of what he's done. It gives you an idea of the attitude of General Krstić personally, but more than that. Because, as you'll see over and over again in this case, the theme that a commander leads by example. When a commander exhibits this kind of nationalistic horror, he is signaling to his troops that it's okay. When Mladić issues orders saying remove the population, he's signaling to his generals and his troops that it's okay. When a commander allows this and sells this and pushes this and acts like this, this is what leads to the kind of tragedy we have. You'll hear Ljubomir Nikolić. He stood up and testified that he allowed the horror of Potocari happen in front of him. The kickings onto the bus, the beatings, the people being taken off. And he said by his very presence as an officer from the brigade, he contributed to what was going on. And any other officers present that allowed this to happen in front of them contributed to this. This is a very important command concept that I know General Pandurević has been taught, and I know the other people have been taught, and they've seen it happen. And a commander leads by example. The examples set early on were this. Here's a classic example. Lead by genocide. Okay. Now let's chronologically go to the case itself. Excuse me a minute. I'm going to get away from the machine for just a second. And I don't know if you can all see that. There's not a perfect place to put it. Okay, if we can put it on the chair. The witness chair. Thank you for helping that. I hope you can get some idea of that. Well, the attack began in earnest on 6 July, and by 9 or 10 July, the Muslim forces were beginning to crumble. The UN, who had been the focus of near attacks, they shot in and around the OPs, the posts that were all around the enclave. They started moving back towards their base in Potocari. At one point, I believe it was on the 7th or 8th of July, a Muslim army person got very upset by this and tossed a hand grenade onto a Dutch armored personnel carrier and killed a Dutch soldier. After that, the Dutch went to the Serb side and were taken by the VRS in a humanitarian way and set up in the Hotel Fontana. However, they were not allowed to return to their base a few short miles down the road to Potocari. They were held there. And as you'll see from the evidence, they were held there as hostages. So we have hostages on the 8th of July, 9th of July. So by the 9th and 10th of July, the Muslim forces are crumbling. For some reason, the BIH forces had taken Nasser Orich and his chief people out of the enclave several weeks earlier. And so the people that were there in command tried, but got no help from NATO or the UN forces. And so by the 10th of July, it looked pretty grim for the people of the enclave. The UN is trying to get NATO airstrikes approved through the UN bureaucracy, and that's not happening. And the Muslim army is crumbling under the tough attack of Pandurević and the other forces. And so in discussion with Radovan Karadzic, Karadzic decides that it's time to take the enclave, that the position is right, that the UN is not putting up any resistance, and if they do, they have hostages. And so what we find the next day, on the 11th of July, is when the NATO actually does come in and as a last-ditch effort to try to bomb the Serb forces, and they do drop a couple of bombs. The NATO, the command of the Dutch battalion receives word from the Serb forces that we're going to kill your men that we have unless that stops. So that stopped. No more NATO Air Force, and the Serbs are free now to roll right in. Now we see the decision of President Karadzic on July 10th in a document, which I'll show you a little later when I get to the specific evidence regarding General Gvero, because it's a letter from Ptolemir, who is passing on the directions of the president, saying it's now time to go in and take the enclave. You'll also see the president ordering that the UNPROFOR not be touched and the civilians not be touched and the Geneva Conventions be used. That's on the 10th. Of course, the very next day, the Serb authorities threatened to kill all the hostages. But The important part about this letter is that it's directly personally to Generals Krstić and Gvero, who at the forward command post at Prosecution. That shows that General Gvero is at the command post with General Krstić, who is leading the attack. So this is a very typical Mladić command structure. He's got Milovanović in the Krajina, he's got Tolimir in the Žepa area, and he's got Gvero at the key point during the key moment of Srebrenica. And so on 11 July, Mladić marches triumphantly through the city of Srebrenica with Vinko Pandurević, with Krstić, with General Živanović, who was the then Corps commander of the Drina Corps. Popović is there. You'll see this on video. It's an amazing, amazing video of what happened. And if we could go to an exhibit, I'll just take a still just to give you a bit of a flavor of the Mladić looking in to the camera that is purposefully being done. He looks into the camera and he says, "Finally, after the rebellion against the Dahis, the time has come to take revenge upon the Turks in this region." This is, again, a foreshadowing of Mladić's intent and what he has in mind. Now, the rebellion against the Dahis occurred on the 13th of July in 1817 and was an uprising of Serbs against Turkish mercenaries or rulers of some sort. So we have Mladić going back well into history and for Serb television, giving them this message, which was to foreshadow the events. So on the 10th, the 11th of July, we, in response to the Serbs making it into the town of Srebrenica after shelling civilian targets, dropping at least several mortars into a crowd of people around the Dutch battalion, the women and children and some men move towards Potocari, which down here, as you can see, is just a few kilometers north of Srebrenica, and is where the main Dutch Bat compound is. They have a small compound in Srebrenica, but it is under shelling and pressure from the Serbs, soon dismantled. So by the evening of 11 July, Srebrenica has been taken. Some 20 to 30,000 women, children, and military, and roughly 1,000 military-age men have moved into Potocari. At the same time, about 15,000, mostly military-age men, but some women and children, start to move towards the villages of Shushenjari and Yaglici on the map, as you can see them. And where it has been decided that they are going to make a run for it to go through what has been an established smuggling route towards the territory of the BIH army, which is this gray line, towards the town of Nezhuk. Now, this column is hard to estimate, but their best estimate has been about 15,000, about a third of which were armed with automatic weapons or rifles, hunting rifles, with some shoulder RPGs, shoulder-fired grenades, and little else. You'll see an amazing video scene of these men assembling, with a few with rifles and many without. And so they are gathering on the evening of the 11th, the late night of the 12th, and begin to head across the tough terrain from Yaglici northward. At this point, there's nothing really much stopping them but a minefield and a few civilian soldiers in trenches that really aren't prepared to handle that kind of event. And the area they go in is so rough, there's not even trenches down there. But the night of the 11th of July, there are two famous meetings between Miletić and the Dutch Battalion Command at the Hotel Fontana in Bratunac. The Dutch command, of course, was very concerned with the situation, was not allowed to have any outside help from NATO or from Morion was not allowed to come in, or Janvier, who would have been the person that was president and in charge at the time. And so they were on their own, and you'll see that, and you'll see how frightening this situation was. So Karaman's asked for a meeting, and they have a meeting, and Miletić at that meeting threatens Karaman, screams at him, you'll see the tape, and then ask for a Muslim representative to come an hour later. The Dutch go get a Muslim representative from the crowd, just a guy that was a teacher. And he comes that night, and Miletić talks with him, and Miletić is obsessed with the military. Where are the military? Turn, the military-age men, demanding their surrender and that everything will be fine. And he looks at this man, and you see it, and he says, "It's up to you, sir, whether your people survive or disappear." It's the most frightening genocidal talk imaginable. And then he sets up a meeting for 10 o'clock the next day where they will organize the transportation of the Muslim population out of Potocari. And so the morning of the 12th, the column has started moving out, and at 10 o'clock they meet again at the Hotel Fontana. But that morning, Serb forces, including Borovčanin's forces, come in to Potocari, you'll see this on the video, and take over control of the situation. This is where crimes first start happening, where the soldiers are allowed to take out their vengeance, their whatever on the civilian population. You'll hear evidence of bodies, of assaults. We have tried to put that in, most of it through 92 bis and other evidence, but it is that's when the horror of Potocari begins. Now, the night of the 11th, Miletić was together with his main commander, General Krstić, also with Živanović. He had an intel officer from the main staff named Radoslav Janković. They were all there together. Popović was in the area, was at the meeting on the morning of the 12th. It's very clear from the evidence that the plot, the plan to absolutely kill and murder the Muslim men of Potocari was hatched that night, the night of the 11th, the night of the 12th. Now, it was clear from intelligence reports that there was roughly 1,000 military-age men in the town of Potocari. So Miletić knew that on the night of the 11th. And when the army refused to surrender and nothing was going to happen, clearly Miletić had made the decision that night that the men would be separated and killed. You'll see as I discuss, the various evidence that supports that. But that's when the decision was made. You first see it again in a televised, well, not televised, but it's video. Some of it is televised, but a video of portions of that meeting. And one part that was cut out of the video was when Miletić told the assembled people at this meeting, again with the Dutch battalion, civilian members of the Muslim community and civilian members of the Bratunac community, Miletić demanded that the able-bodied men 16 to 60 be screened as war criminals. So Miletić had made the decision that night to screen men as war criminals. Okay, now, shortly after that meeting, buses, trucks arrived, and the first separations in Potočari began in the early afternoon. But what we see is no screening. What's happening is a wholesale separation of anybody from roughly 15 up to 78, as you heard the prosecutor, and some very young boys and some very old men, and everyone. No screening, no names, no interrogations to speak of, nothing. That it would have been legitimate for them to go in and look for soldiers and take soldiers aside or people suspected of being soldiers and keep them for exchange. But what was not legitimate was what they did, a wholesale separation and transport out of the area of the men. So this is the first indication that their intentions are not honorable. They had a lot of intelligence they could have gained, a lot of value in having hundreds of prisoners, because there were hundreds of Serb prisoners in Muslim prisons. And these men could have been exchanged to get their own soldiers back. But instead, wholesale screening, nobody is writing names down, and most importantly, they're not given any food, any medical help. They're put in horrendous conditions where they're jammed in buildings and vehicles, and they're beaten and starved and killed over the 2 or 3 days that the men from Potočari were stored there. So when you put all that together and you see this happening on the morning or the afternoon of the 12th, the evening of the 12th, 13th, continually goes on. It's very clear that Mladić, what he had in mind for these men of Potočari, that they were marked for death. There's no question about that when you put all the evidence together. There's a photograph we have of a huge, massive pile of IDs burning on the side of the road in Potočari, I think on the 14th of July. IDs, any documents in any military interest is a key thing to get when interrogating someone, so you know who they are, what unit they may be from, that kind of material. Burned without a care in the world. They had no idea that the international forces of NATO would be visiting them in January of the next year, and the arrogance by which they perpetrated this is amazing. So on the afternoon of 12 July, the forcible transfers and murders begin. Just to give you the briefest look of a photo of Potočari, so you can get a feel for this. You'll see the video. I don't want to take the time to show you the video now, but if we have that photo of these thousands of people in Potočari. I don't recall if this is the 12th or 13th, but it gives you an idea of just the masses of numbers of people. And in this crowd, you'll see military-age men, most of whom are now dead. And if we could go to the next photograph of the men separated. There's another still photograph. It's hard to tell from this photograph, but these are trucks. And the women are walking on one side of the trucks and the men are walking on the other. They have been separated and directed. And take a look at the men. Look at these old guys. They're not interviewed, they're not interrogated, they're just separated out. And we have several of these men have been identified and presumed dead. We'll have a booklet of these stills that identify the people that have been killed. But this is the separation, the wholesale screening. Not wholesale separation, non-screening, excuse me. Okay, if we could go to I think we have another one of Mr. Borovčanin. This is 13 July and Mr. Borovčanin, whose troops have been in and around Potočari on the 12th and 13th, taking part in the separations. This is a United Nations military observer in the forefront, Mr. Kingori from Kenya, and with a Dutch officer. And they're discussing the various events. Kingori is very concerned about what's going on right across the street from where they're standing. Don't know, do we have a picture now of the White House? Right across from where Mr. Borovčanin is standing, and this will be made more clear in the video, is the famous White House where men, after they were separated, were taken. Here's a shot of the balcony of the White House, some, 40 meters, 30 meters from where Borovčanin is standing facing this. These are the Muslim men huddled in a mass looking through the slats of the balcony. All those men are to be killed later down the road, 2-3 days later. And if they're lucky, they're killed in Bratunac by a soldier with a gun. Now, Ljubomir Nikolić will tell you that he coordinated the separations and the movement of the population out, and he did it with a commander under Mr. Borovčanin's command named Duškojević, known as Stalin. He's the person I spoke of earlier that is pretty good with the organization and was present in Potocari, but didn't see anybody separated. Ljubomir Nikolić will also tell you that on the morning of 12 July, after the morning meeting at the Hotel Fontana, Vujadin Popović and the Drina Corps intelligence officer, Mr. Kosarić, came up to him and said that the decision has been made to separate the military-age men and kill them. And we need you to help organize this and help get the job done. And they ask him for locations to kill people. He provides them with the locations of something called the Brick Factory, which you may soon see. It's an area on the outskirts of Bratunac, a lot like the Kravica warehouse, perfect for storing people to be killed. And then Ljubomir Nikolić acknowledges that he took part in the separation and the movement of the women and children and the men, knowing that the men were all going to be killed. Okay, on the 12th of July in the evening, there is a meeting with General Mladić, General Krstić, and the brigade commanders. After Srebrenica fell on the 11th, most of the brigade commanders involved in the assault stood down briefly. They weren't exactly sure where the forces of Nasser Orj were. They thought they were in the area called the Bandera Triangle, south of the enclave. But on the 12th, Mladić called a meeting of all the commanders. And it's important to note that at this point, the murder operation has been decided. There are probably 500 to 1,000 Muslim men separated and jammed into vehicles and schools at the Vuk Karadzic school complex in Bratunac. And they're beginning to be preyed upon, beaten, killed by their captors. So just down the road from that is the meeting at the Bratunac Brigade headquarters. And it's clear that Vinko Pandurević is there with General Krstić, General Mladić. There are other brigade commanders. Mirko Trivić, the commander of the 2nd Romania Brigade, will tell us some about what happened at that meeting. I'm sure not all. But it's inconceivable that evening that Mladić and Krstić did not inform Generals Pandurević and others, Colonel Pandurević at the time, and others, of what was going on and the plan. Now, it's also important to note that at this time there had been no plan to move any prisoners up to Zvornik. All they had and all they really knew about were the 1,000 men from Potocari. And they were looking to murder them around Bratunac in places that Ljubomir Nikolić had talked about, the brick factory. So, but given that, and the import of that, and the fact that they're all together in the command, it's beyond belief that they did not discuss this. But what you will hear about is that now Mladić had made the decision to take on Žepa. And so Mladić tells his commanders at a brief meeting that, okay, on to Žepa, we've got Srebrenica, on to Žepa. Some of the brigade commanders, Vinko Pandurević being one of them, stood up to Mladić and said, that his troops were tired, that they needed some rest, and perhaps there were other military reasons that he had. And Mladić insisted, and the brigade commanders were able to convince Mladić to come down to this area of Viogor where the troops were established and give the troops a pep talk and get them going, which is what he did the next day. Okay, that takes us to the 13th of July. Now on the 13th of July, we have the column moving out from Yagrichi and Shushenjari on the night of the 11th. And on the 12th, a significant number of them make it across this road, the Nova Kasaba, Konjević Polje, Bratunac road. The great flaw in the Serb intelligence is they don't realize at the time that how many did. At least 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 Muslim men made it across that road early on in this. But at least half the column got stuck back. By the night of the 12th, with the help of Borovčanin's forces and other forces coming in, the Serbs were able to seal off this road from Nova Kasaba, Konjević Polje, and to Kravica, the area where the Muslim column were advancing. So by the morning of the 13th, there was an iron ring on that road, and some 6,000 Muslim men, 6,000 Muslim men were trapped up in the woods behind it. And the Serb forces went up and down that road with megaphones and dressed in UN gear and with UN APCs, calling them down to surrender, that they would be safe, that the UN would look out for them, and many did. 5,000, 6,000 under the Serb numbers. On the 13th, this happened. And they were assembled at various places, Sandici, Nova Kasaba, and sent to the warehouse in Kravica. Now, it's the morning of the 13th, another watershed date and time to remember that the organized mass executions really begin. Before that, we've seen isolated acts of brutality and death. Isolated. In the context of Srebrenica, that means 100 people minimum, bodies piling up in the Vuk school complex, bodies in the woods in Potocari. But we don't see the kind of organized mass executions that this case is known for. But on the morning of 13 July, 16 men or Muslims are assembled at the intersection of Konjević Polje, and they're put on a bus, and they're taken up to an area just north of that, along the river, the Yadar River, just about here. We'll get a better map of that so you can see that. And they're taken down to the river and executed. We know that because a man survived that. He was shot through the shoulder, fell into the river, and the river had a pretty good current, and it washed him away. And he managed to survive and tell the story. And he's got a bullet hole in his shoulder to prove it. But the important thing about this story is that they took a bus. Now, a bus at this time of day was a crucial item because they were really trying to get the women and children out of Potocari. So for the military or the MOOC to get a bus showed that there's some organization behind these killings, and that killing 16 people using a bus is not something privates or sergeants are going to do on their own. So that's our first indication that we have an organized mass execution going on. Then a little bit later, maybe 12, 1 o'clock, we have a witness that sees 3 busloads of Muslims go down a little road towards the Sirska Valley, right here. He's up in the woods looking down, and he sees it followed by an APC with soldiers, and then shortly after by an excavator. And he hears all kinds of gunfire, and shortly thereafter the buses come back empty, and the bulldozer comes back, and as does the APC. As he's trying to escape north, he comes across an area that had horrible smell, and he showed us that area. And back in, I believe it was 1998, we excavated that and found 150 Muslim men with their hands tied behind their back with wire ligatures and shell casings all over the road, and dirt that had obviously been moved by an excavator just thrown on top of them. So that murder happened about 1 o'clock p.m. Obviously, again, the important part about this murder for our purposes is it had 3 buses, an APC, and an excavator. Privates, sergeants, they don't do that on their own. This mass execution is happening at this point at the highest channels now. Sirska Valley shows it. But what perhaps the VRS didn't understand is the massive amount of prisoners they would get. By the afternoon of 13 July, it's not just 150 men here or 16 men there. They literally have 5,000 or 6,000 people assembled. And I believe it becomes clear to them that they cannot kill all these people in Bratunac. Though you'll hear testimony that Beara wanted to. He wanted to start doing it and was very angry when they didn't. But on the evening of 13 July, most of the prisoners that had been held in Novokasaba and Sandici, these big fields, had been transported to Bratunac or the village of Kravica, where they were stored. About 1,000 of them were put in this Kravica warehouse just outside the little village area. And in the afternoon, it was decided that they should be murdered. Near the same time that buses were being transported down the road. They parked buses in front of the warehouse, and they began killing people. And the killing lasted for hours and hours. There was at least 800 to 1,000 people in 2 sides of this warehouse. I'm going to go into that in more detail with you when I get to Borovčanin, because this is a murder crime that you really need to understand the warehouse and what the witnesses are saying and what Borovčanin is saying. It's a whole event within a trial itself. And it's unlike most of these cases, the detail of this event will be important for your consideration. Okay, now, as I mentioned, there were so many prisoners on the 13th, they couldn't kill them all, and they made the decision to move them up to Zvornik. We know this. Well, Ljubomir Nikolić tells us this. In fact, Ljubomir Nikolić says that he goes and sees Drago Nikolić and provides him the information about that. But we also have a survivor from a school in Bratunac who was put in a vehicle along with 50 to 100 others and shipped up to the Zvornik area the night of the 13th and put in the Orahovac school. Right here, not far from the Zvornik Brigade headquarters. So we know that on the night of the 13th that they realized they cannot kill everyone in the Bratunac area. You'll hear a famous intercept between Miroslav Daronic, the head of the SDS party, and Radovan Karadzic, where Karadzic is of the thousands in the schools and says, yes, but get them into warehouses outside. And Drago says, yes. And Drago will testify about that. So on the 13th, the Muslim men are beginning to be sent off to Zvornik. Now, on the 13th, Colonel Pandurević was sent with his troops to Žepa and was in the Žepa area of operations at the time this decision was made, but he would have been in radio contact and been able to be identified. And this is the kind of thing, as I go back to Deputy Commander, that he would have been told about. And you'll hear about the evidence that he was told about it, but he's on the radio, he's available, and he's contactable by the radio. But the next day, in the morning of the 14th, the attack begins, and his troops are a part of that attack. Anyway, back to the evening of the 13th, this is where the Muslims are held at the schools, some few hundred that night, but then for whatever reason, under the darkness or the security situation, because the Muslim column is still out there, they stop their transporting that night. And on the morning of the 14th, they gather a massive convoy of buses and trucks to load these some 5,000, perhaps 6,000 Muslim men and boys that have been stored in Bratanac and Kravica, the surviving ones, and ship them up to Zvornik. This column is led by Lieutenant Colonel Popović and the chief of the Bratanac Brigade military police and others. On the afternoon of 14 July, the organized murders begin at the Orahovac school. Men are taken out of the school building, put on little Zvornik Brigade trucks, moved about less than a kilometer down the road, unloaded, and summarily executed by firing squad, members of the Zvornik Brigade. All of this is done by members of the Zvornik Brigade. And specifically, the 4th Battalion are involved. At the same time, there are people that have been moved to the schools at Petkovci, Ročević, and in the school at Kula in the area of Pilica and the Pilica Cultural Center. I will go in some more detail about each of the accused, their whereabouts, and their involvement at the end, probably tomorrow. The executions at Petkovci started late night, the 14th, after the executions had finished at Orahovac. Went all night, probably 800 to 1,000 persons murdered. We don't know who actually pulled the trigger during that. We know that the battalion, I believe it's the 6th Battalion of the Zvornik Brigade, was involved in transporting people to be killed, and the school was right across the street from the battalion command post. And you'll hear testimony from the battalion commander and deputy commander about Beara being present and organizing these prisoners. The next day, on the 15th, Pandurević has been given an urgent call from Obrenović. The column is really beginning to threaten Zvornik on the 14th. There's clashes here between the column and the Zvornik Brigade forces. The Zvornik Brigade realizes that it's not the 200 or 300 that they originally thought. It's more like 5,000, and Obrenović is getting pretty panicked. And so on the night of the 14th, he calls for urgent help and asks for Vinko Pandurević. But I left out a key point. I'm sorry, I want to go back on Obrenović. As you know, Obrenović pled guilty. And on the evening of the 13th, Obrenović will testify that while he's dealing with the column, he gets a phone call from Drago Nikolić, who has been assigned to be at the Zvornik Brigade forward command post up here in the woods. And roughly what Drago Nikolić tells him is that thousands of prisoners are coming to Zvornik. It's been ordered that they be detained and shot, and that he needs to be relieved from his duties at the forward command post to help organize this and facilitate it. Obrenović says, wait a minute, we've got to have authority from our commander on this. And Nikolić says it's coming from the top, and he's been contacted and by Popović, I believe, and that it's coming from the top, that the command is coming from the commanders. At that point, Obrenović, trusting his security officer and being part of what Obrenović called the vortex of hatred, relieved Drago Nikolić from his responsibility, authorized him to get military police to begin the job of guarding and receiving these prisoners and killing them, and authorized the entire murder operation for that area, and pled guilty to that. So, but getting back to the 14th, he manages to get through to the Drina Command, who gets through to Pandurević. Pandurević comes back mid-morning, probably around noon on the 15th. Now, when Pandurević arrives, everyone at Arahovac is dead, and the burying process is continuing. That's roughly 1,000 people. Everyone from Petkovci is dead, and the burying process is happening that day that he's coming back. And this is Zvornik Brigade engineering officers and equipment that are involved in this massive burial process. So when he comes back, everybody from those two schools is dead, roughly 2,000 people. But there are still at least 1,500 located in Pilica, in the cultural center, and the school at Kula, and maybe 500, maybe 800 located in the school in Ročević, who are in the process of being killed as he comes back. Obrenović reports all of this to him. Fundamentally, that they're having problems guarding and burying all these people. There's no mention of problems killing them. It's the guarding them and burying them is a big problem. And Pandurević's response to Obrenović on that point was, well, civil protection was supposed to take care of that. Now, civil protection is the outfit that does sanitation and burials, and had taken care of this in Bratanac. So this was an indication to Obrenović that Pandurević had been informed and was probably not happy about his units having to take part in this to take them away from their duties, and had been informed that civil protection would be doing that. He's not concerned about the deaths of these men. He's concerned about his units and men that would take them away from their military duties. So after Pandurević gets briefed on Obrenović, has other meetings at the brigade command, he does what a good commander should do, and he goes out to the front and leads the defense. He initially argued with Obrenović and the other folks who said, we need to open a column, we need to open this and let these people through, because we're going to lose too many troops in the process. We can't deal with the situation. The situation is thus. The front line is here. BIH troops are here north of Nezuk with artillery, with men in trenches, with other equipment, and you've got some 6,000 partially armed men coming at them from their rear. And on the night of the 15th, Zvornik is in trouble. And initially, Pandurević disagrees and wants to take on this whole column. But when he gets there, there's a huge, in the morning of the 16th, and you'll read about it in the intercepts, and there's a 19th century battle is the only way I can describe it. Just many of them unarmed men swarming over trenches of the Zvornik Brigade, taking their heavy weapons and turning them on the Zvornik Brigade. By the early morning hours of the 16th, the Zvornik Brigade has lost some 50 people Now, in this war, 50 people in a morning battle is enormous losses. And it's at that point that Pandurević rethinks his decision, and eventually the decision is made to open up an area to allow the rest of the people to go through. That stays open for a couple of days and then is closed. But it's done not out of humanitarian reasons, but because 50 Serb boys were killed because of Mladić's wonderful scheme to take the Srebrenica enclave. So also on the day of the 16th, the executions continue. Popović is involved in, and so is Beara, in the killings up in Pilica, where there's some, as I said, about 1,000 people at the school, maybe 500 in the cultural center. You'll see the specific evidence that showing their involvement, and the 10th Sabotage Detachment that was brought in to help the killing process. But the killing occurred at the Branjevo military farm. It's called the Branjevo military farm because it was just that. It was a unit of the Zvornik Brigade that raised pigs and grew crops to feed the troops. And it was led by an officer and had soldiers working there. And this was made available for this operation. And it was Vinko Pandurević's unit and Vinko Pandurević's land. And it was his soldiers that helped make all this happen. They were guarding the people at the school. They were holding down the Branjevo farm. The 10th Sabotage came in to actually do most of the killing and then moved down to the Pilica Cultural Center in the afternoon of the 16th to kill off the people at the Cultural Center. On the 15th, the executions had occurred at a place called Kozluk, just so that sticks in your head. And it's not far from the Ročević school. Now, after the murders in Pilica on 19th of July, we see many Muslim groups are still caught in the woods and running around, and a unit from the Krajina Corps that was sent and resubordinated to Vinko Pandurević captured a group of people, I think there was 10 of them, and according to the survivor, they got on the radio, talked to someone on the radio, and after that, everyone except one was shot and killed. Our survivor was shot in the back and rolled down a hill and was able to escape to tell us this. But those men were under the command of Vinko Pandurević, resubordinated to his brigade. You'll see the order or the directive by General Miletić assigning that Krajina Corps crew to Zvornik to help the situation, the combat situation that was going on. So you can see from some amazing evidence the linkage between all these people. I'm not going to go into the detail of all the other murders. You'll hear about the murder of some 16 patients that were seriously injured near Milici down in the south and were sent to the Zvornik hospital. But instead of the ICRC being brought in, these seriously injured people were sent to the Zvornik Brigade headquarters on around the 14th, 15th, something like that, and were held in their area, in their medical area. And you'll hear from the doctors from the Zvornik hospital came and treated them. And Obrenović went in and looked after them because there was issues related to the soldiers not liking Muslims being in the command. And shortly after this, Popović arrived and those prisoners were taken out, and they've never been seen since. Why they needed to kill 16 people from Miletić that were seriously injured patients, I don't know, but they did. We have their names. They're clearly on the missing list. And Mr. Popović is related to that. We know from a survivor of the Braniewo farm that he, in his escape from under the bodies on the 16th, he finds 4 other survivors from the Braniewo farm, and he learns about what villages they're from, and he sees the blood on them and hears their story. And then a few days later, they were assisted by a couple of soldiers from the Zvornik Brigade and given a sandwich and told where the front line was. These guys were farmers. I think they were helping their family at the time, and helped out these 4 pathetic Muslim guys. Well, those 4 guys, the Muslims, got captured later on and were interrogated by Drago Nikolic's MPs, and admitted they were helped by some Zvornik folks. The MPs, Nikolić was able to identify who the soldiers were that helped them, and Vinko Pandurević and Drago Nikolić prosecuted those Serb soldiers that assisted these guys by giving them a sandwich and telling them where the front line is. They prosecuted them for assisting the enemy and punished them. And you'll see the documents that support that. So we have the names of these 4 Muslim survivors. And you won't be surprised to hear that all 4 of those names are on the ICRC missing list, because after they were used as witnesses against the Serbs, they were executed. Maybe someday their bones will be identified, and their loved ones will know that. Okay, we've got a little time left, and I don't want to take too much time tomorrow. So, if you don't mind, I think I'll start with Chapter 3, which I call the linkage material. And with the help of Ms. Stewart, we'll go through that. And the first linkage material I'm going to talk about is, well, the first person we'll talk about is General Miletić. And the first document I want to go to is a document you've seen part of. It's Directive 7, the famous Directive 7, that was drafted by Miletić, where he wrote out the part about make life unbearable. Well, there's also a part at the very end, which I believe Janet has marked for us, regarding the logistic support for this operation. And I'm sorry if I could take just 1 second to grab that. And I'll just read it briefly. The relevant state and military organs responsible for work with UNPROFOR and humanitarian organizations shall, through a planned and unobtrusively restrictive issuing of permits, reduce and limit the logistics support of UNPROFOR to the enclaves and supply of material resources to the Muslim population, making them dependent on our goodwill, while at the same time avoiding condemnation by the international community and international public opinion. All right. They're making the Muslims dependent upon their goodwill, keeping the supplies to a minimum, yet not so bad that the international community is going to notice. You'll see the evidence to support exactly what they did. So this goes along with making life unbearable. And General Miletić played a major role in the convoys and what convoys went and what convoys didn't. And let's go now to an 18
June document. This is a June 18th it's called an open message under the name of General Miletić. It's from the main staff, and it's I'm not going to read it all to you, but it's talking about supplying the various materials to the enclaves. And in the end of it, General Miletić says, and this is, you can see he's sending it to the Zvornik Brigade and the various brigades that have to do with the enclaves. I demand a detailed check of all vehicles, including the inspection of cargo. Pay special attention to the fuel in the fuel tanks and the fuel being brought into the enclaves. Check the documents and the identity of all persons on board. Make a list of their names and their ID cards in order to ensure that the persons who enter the enclaves must leave the enclaves upon the completion of the task. Now, this shows that General Miletić is playing a very important role in this. Now, on its face, there's nothing criminal about this, but it does indicate to us the role he's playing. And he can say to the Zvornik Brigade, I demand a detailed, now is that an order from a commander? No. Is it a directive you have to follow? Yes. This is consistent with Mladić's overall order, Directive 7, and the other materials that we've seen establishing the policy. And you'll see, speaking of fuel, how fuel was restricted and strangled. So by the time Dutch Bat was there in July when these events happened, they didn't have any fuel to run their air conditioning or their electrical, and they couldn't go out in vehicles. And this is all the main staff's doing through their corps, through their brigades, as it was done with General Miletić. Okay, one more, I think, the 13th July document. Thank you. Now, this is an amazing document that was found recently in the Drinacore collection, jammed in amongst a whole bunch of other telegrams, and obviously missed by anybody going through this material. It's a communication authored by Lieutenant Colonel Milomir Savcic. Milomir Savcic is the commander of the 65th Protection Regiment. He is in a place called Borike, down by Žepa, where Ptolemir has been stationed to look after the Žepa attack. And Savcic has received a proposal from Ptolemir regarding all these massive amounts of prisoners that are being caught in the area of Nova Kasaba and Sandici. And so I want to look at every word on this one because we don't see many documents like this. It's entitled Procedure for Treatment of Prisoners of War. To the commander of the GSVRS, that's the main staff. That's, of course, Mladić. And for his information, Assistant Commander for Religious and Legal Affairs. And for his information, we know who that is. That's Gvero. And the commander of the Military Police Battalion of the 65th Protection Regiment. That's this guy Malinic, who I mentioned to you, that introduced a Dutchman to Beara. And it says, order. There are over 1,000 members of the former 28th Division of the so-called BIH Army captured in the area of Dushonovo, or Kasaba. Prisoners are under the control of the Military Police Battalion of the 65th Protection Regiment. Okay, well, they have a unit there in Nova Kasaba, and so it's natural that they have been the ones that are dealing with all these prisoners. Assistant Commander for Security and Intelligence Affairs of the main staff, of course we know who that is, Tolomir, proposes the following measures. Prohibit access to all unauthorized individuals filming and photographing of prisoners. Prohibit traffic for all United Nations vehicles en route to Zvornik, Vlasenica until further notice. Commander of the Military Police Battalion shall take measures to remove war prisoners from the main Milici-Zvornik road, place them somewhere indoors or in an area protected from observation from the ground or the air. Now, these hundreds of prisoners, as I've said before, are a great bargaining tool to receive for exchange. And the first thing you would want to do in that situation is bring in the ICRC, get these people registered, get them, and you can screen the ones that are military-age men and get them taken care of. Why in the world would you hide them unless you had some nefarious activity? And let's look at who they're hiding them from. Perhaps you hide them from the Bosnian Muslim army that might try to break them out. Though that's completely unrealistic. They are the Bosnian Muslim army. They're nowhere near the Second Corps forces at this point. There's no air force. There's no way that the Bosnian army can do anything about these guys. So who are they keeping them from when they're being observed from the ground or the air? The only people that are in the air in July of 1995 are NATO. They don't want these guys seen by NATO. They don't want the international community to know they exist. This is a very strong indication that the murder operation is in play. These people are to be hidden from the international community so they can be killed. Mr. Savcic was shown this document and wouldn't contest it, but wouldn't acknowledge it. And I asked him, who are they hiding these guys from? And he said, well, NATO. And I asked, well, why are they hiding them from NATO? And he thought about that for a bit and said, well, we would have been concerned that NATO mistook them for being Serbs and would have bombed them. And again, you can tell from an answer like that that he doesn't want to be anywhere near this, and it really tells us what this document's about. But then let's go on in the document. Once the commander of the Military Police Battalion receives this order, he shall contact General Miletić and receive from him additional orders and verify if the proposal has been approved by the commander of the main staff. Okay, so we have Tolomir involved in this, we've got Gvero involved in this, we've got Miletić involved in this, we've got Mladic involved. One document, they've got them all. Now, this is the lineup. It's the lineup for genocide. And it importantly shows who the important players are. Miletić is going to issue orders relating to these guys. This is an extremely important document to show you who is important, who's involved, and what they're up to. And I think this is probably a place where I need to stop.
Okay, I thank you so much, Mr. McCloskey. You may sit down. You will continue tomorrow. So we finished at... Okay, earlier on I mentioned an outstanding motion that was filed confidential and under seal relating to a request from the prosecution for protective measures for four different persons. As far as possible, I would like to have the debate in open session. However, if any names of witnesses are going to be mentioned in particular, then obviously we will need to go into private or closed session. I don't think there is a need to mention witnesses by name. You can actually refer to them the same way they have been referred in the motion itself, namely by reference to the pseudonym that was used in each case in either or both of the previous cases, the Kirstic and the Blagojevic one. Who is going to address Madame Nikolić? Is it going to be a joint submission, or is it only on behalf of your client?
Yes, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
This would be a joint submission on our part to avoid unnecessary repetition. We shall briefly address the trial chamber on the defense's position relative to the prosecution's request for protective measures for the four witnesses who ought to be heard in the first session. All the defense teams do not oppose the prosecution request for measures for the four witnesses, since these are witnesses who had been accorded protective measures under Rule 675F earlier. What the defense wishes to tell the trial chamber is as follows: that one of the witnesses, marked L, who testified in the Milosevic case as B1399, 1999. The matter of the fact is that in the Blagojevic case, this same witness testified in an open session without any protective measures.
But this way you have indirectly. So we need to redact this part of the.
I apologize.
Of the transcript. We are transmitting. One moment, Madam Nikolić.
Could we move?
Madam Registrar, we are transmitting with a 30-minute delay, I suppose. Yes. Okay. So we need to redact from line.
22, page 87.
Yes, page 87, line 22, yes.
24.
To 24. Thank you. Thank you, Judge Ogon. Yes, let's go into private session, and you're free to make any comment you like, and when you finish. On the prosecution motion, Mr. Kirgovic.
Yes, Your Honor. I wanted to seize the opportunity to raise one matter in the context of procedural matters, which relates to the application of e-court in the courtroom. In the pending cases before the tribunal, at the point the defense was to cross-examine a witness, the defense delivered the documents that it was going to use in cross-examination at the time when the witness was swearing in. We did not discuss these matters yet, and I move that the trial chamber issue a decision applying the same procedure that was applied in the Milutinovic et al. Case, which is the decision issued on the 16th of August 2006, wherein it is stated that the defense is duty-bound to upload into e-court all the documents that it will be using in the course of its cross-examination at the point when the witness is giving his solemn declaration, from which point the prosecution can no longer get in touch with the witness. I move that the same procedure be applied in this case. The prosecution in that other case was not opposed to such a course of proceeding. Thank you.
Right. I think we can safely take this up tomorrow or some other time when it becomes necessary to decide. I see your point, Mr. Kirgovic, and I appreciate your submission. I think we need to adjourn now. We will resume or reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. How long do you think you will require, Mr. McCloskey?
Hopefully one session, but perhaps two. These are documents, and I will try to resist talking too much about them. I know you will hear testimony about them.
So far, you've been roughly speaking for 3 hours. Yeah. Okay. I thank you all. The sitting is adjourned. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.
All rise, 5 minutes.